Hey, welcome back everyone. If you're settling in right now, maybe curled up on the couch, lights turned low, the day finally behind you, I am really glad you are here. Tonight we're going back to a world so different from our own that it almost feels like a dream. A world without alarm clocks, without calendars on the wall, without a glowing screen on your nightstand telling you it is 2 a.m. and you really should be asleep by now. And here is the question I want you to sit with for just a moment. If none of those things existed, if there were no clocks, no watches, no phones, how would an entire city know when to wake up, when to open the market, when to stop working, when to go home? The answer, and I think this is going to surprise you more than you expect, was a sound. A single, deep, resonating sound that rolled across the rooftops, down the narrow streets, into every home, every field, every workshop. The sound of a bell. And once you understand what that bell actually meant to people living in medieval towns, you will never hear a church bell the same way again. Before we dive in, if this kind of story is the reason you come here, I would love it if you could take just a second, hit that like button, leave a comment down below and subscribe if you have not already. It genuinely means the world, and it helps more people find their way to these stories at the end of a long day. Also, I am curious, where are you watching this from right now? Are you in bed, on the couch? Maybe somewhere totally unexpected. Drop it in the comments. I love reading those. Now go ahead and dim your lights just a little, let whatever quiet sound you love fill the room, and let us begin. So let us start at the very beginning. Imagine you're a baker living in a medieval English town sometime around the year 1200. Your name is Thomas. You live in a small timber house on a narrow muddy lane. Your wife is asleep beside you. Your 2 children are bundled up near the fire, and you need to know right now, this very moment, what time it is, because if your bread is not ready by the time the market opens, you lose a full day of income, and in the year 1200, losing a full day of income is not just inconvenient, it is genuinely dangerous. But here is the problem. There is no clock on your wall. There is no sundial inside your dark home. There is no rooster that you can trust to be accurate, because roosters, as anyone who has lived near one knows, are not exactly reliable timekeeping devices. So what does Thomas do? He listens. He waits for the sound that will tell him, with the authority of the entire town behind it, that the day has officially begun. Now I want to pause here for just a second, because I think most of us have a vague idea that medieval life was simpler, slower, less complicated, and in some ways that is true. But here is something that does not get talked about enough. The absence of a shared sense of time created a kind of low-level chaos that touched absolutely everything. Historians who study medieval urban life have pointed out that without a universal timekeeping system, merchants could not agree on when deals were supposed to be honoured. Courts could not enforce when a hearing was supposed to start. Guilds could not guarantee that workers showed up at the same time. Markets could not function properly because no one agreed on when they opened or closed. Think about what that actually means for daily life. Picture a market square in a town like York or Canterbury in the early 11th century. Some vendors have been set up since what they believe is sunrise. Others arrive what they think is an hour later, but their sense of an hour is based entirely on their own gut feeling, the position of the sun on a cloudy morning, or a vague memory of how long the walk from their house usually takes. Someone starts selling grain early. Someone else thinks they're cheating. An argument breaks out. Nothing gets resolved because there is no shared reference point, no common answer to the simple question, what time is it right now? This is not a small problem. This is the kind of problem that, left unsolved, quietly erodes the ability of a community to function at all. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Before bells became the dominant timekeeping tool of medieval towns, people used a remarkable variety of methods, and some of them are genuinely fascinating. The ancient Romans used water clocks called clepsydry devices that measured time by the slow drip of water from one vessel into another. They were reasonably accurate, but they froze in winter and drifted constantly, and they were expensive. Only the wealthy could afford them. Monasteries used sand timers and candle clocks, candles that burned at a known rate with markings along the side like a ruler. King Alfred the Great of England, the Alfred who famously burned the cakes, actually used candle clocks to divide his day into 8 equal 3-hour segments. He had lanterns built around the candles to protect them from drafts, which tells you everything about how precious and temperamental those time measurements were. Sundials were perhaps the most widespread tool, and medieval towns often had a single large sundial mounted on the south-facing wall of the church. But here is the thing about sundials. They only work when the sun is shining, in England, in November, in a narrow lane between 2 tall buildings. You see the problem. There was also a human solution, and honestly this one is my personal favourite. In many medieval towns there existed a figure known as the knocker-up. This was a person, usually a man, sometimes an older woman, whose entire job was to walk through the streets before dawn and knock on the shuttered windows of people who needed to be woken at specific time. They used long poles. Some had a pea shooter to rattle the upstairs windows. Some knocked with a specific rhythm that meant your hour has come, now get up. And then they moved on to the next house. Now I find this genuinely charming in a way that is hard to explain, because what the knocker-up represents is a town that really deeply understood the problem of time and was trying everything it could to solve it. The sundial, the water clock, the candle burning through the night, the human alarm clock wandering through the fog at 4 a.m. All of these were answers to the same desperate question: how do we know when to begin? And none of them was quite good enough. None of them could speak to an entire city at once. None of them had the reach, the clarity, the sheer unstoppable volume of what was coming next. Here is something I want you to really picture. A medieval town was not a quiet place. There were animals everywhere, pigs rooting through the alley, chickens in the yard, horses clattering on the main road. There were vendors calling out children, running hammers, ringing cartwheels, grinding on stone. For a signal to truly reach everyone, the baker 3 streets over, the farmer in the field just outside the town wall, the fisherman down by the river. It had to be something that could cut through all of that noise. Something loud enough to carry 1/4 mile on a still morning. Something distinctive enough that no one could confuse it with anything else. Something that sounded frankly like authority. And in the late 9th and 10th centuries, as towns across England, France and Germany began to grow in ways they never had before, a new kind of bell began appearing in church towers. Not the small handbells that monks had carried for centuries, not the delicate little brass things you might ring at a dinner table. These were massive bronze purpose-built instruments. Some of them weighed as much as a full-grown horse. They could be heard for miles. One of the most staggering records from this period comes from the English historian and monk Bede, who described a death bell at the Abbey of Whitby in the year 680 that was reportedly heard 13 miles away. 13 miles, in an age before electricity, before amplification of any kind. Just bronze and air and silence waiting to receive it. And for the first time in the history of European urban life, an entire city could be held together, not by a rule, not by a person, not by a piece of paper, but by a sound. The historian Alain Corbin, in his remarkable study of bells and community life in France, described the bell tower as the beating heart of the village, the place from which the rhythm of daily existence was broadcast outward to every soul within earshot. And that image stays with me. Because what the medieval bell created was something that no sundial or candle clock could ever give you. It created a shared moment. When that bell rang, Thomas the baker heard it. So did the merchant loading his cart. So did the farmer pulling on his boots. So did the widow saying her morning prayers by candlelight. So did the judge walking to the courthouse. So did the child waking up and not particularly wanting to. All at exactly the same time, all anchored to the same single sound. For one brief resonating moment, an entire city breathed together. And honestly, when I think about how scattered our attention is today, everyone in their own world, everyone on their own private schedule, there is something almost wistful about that. A single bell that rang and made a whole city pause. But here is what I really want you to hold on to as we go deeper into this story tonight. That bell did not just tell people the time, it told them what to do, when they were allowed to buy and sell and when they were not, when to put out their fires before bed, who had just died in their neighborhood, when an enemy was approaching. A single instrument, dozens of meanings, a whole secret language written entirely in sound. And in the parts ahead, we're going to learn every single word of it. Because here is the thing that most people have never stopped to consider. When you understand the bells, you understand how medieval people understood their entire world. And what comes next might be the part that surprises you most of all. Did you know that church bells were not simply built and hung in a tower? They were baptized, anointed with holy oil, given a name, and in some towns, if a bell fell from its tower and killed someone, it was actually put on trial, upended and filled with thorns as punishment. That story is coming up right now. And so we left Thomas the baker listening in the dark, waiting for the sound that would tell him the day had begun. But here is what Thomas knew without ever having been taught it in a classroom. He knew that the bell above him was not just metal. It was alive. Now I realise that sounds a little strange, and if you had told a medieval person that future generations would think of bells as simple noisemakers, decorative things you hang in a garden, or app notifications you swipe away without thinking, they would have looked at you with genuine confusion. Because in the medieval world, a church bell was not an object, it was a presence. And the process of bringing that presence into the world was one of the most elaborate, most solemn, most deeply felt rituals that a community could perform. Let me tell you what it actually looked like. Imagine a town in France, somewhere in the Loire Valley, let us say in the late 12th century. A new bell has been cast. The foundry workers have spent weeks getting it right. The metal, a precise alloy of roughly 78 parts copper, to 22 parts tin, a formula that bell makers guarded like a family secret, has been poured into a carefully prepared mould. The cooling alone takes days. When the mould is finally broken open and the bell emerges for the first time, there is something almost tender about the moment. It is not yet finished. It has not yet found its voice in the full sense of the word. Because before it can be hung in the tower, before it can speak to the town, it must go through something that can only be described as a birth ceremony. And this ceremony had a name that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously people took it. They called it the baptism of the bell. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. By the 11th century canon law, the formal legal code of the Catholic Church had established detailed regulations for how a bell must be consecrated before it could be used. The ceremony was presided over by a bishop, not a priest. A bishop, that is a significant detail, because bishops presided over other baptisms too. The baptism of human beings, of new Christians entering the faith. The parallel was not accidental. The bell was washed, literally scrubbed with water blessed by the bishop. Then it was anointed on the outside with the oil of the sick, a sacred oil, normally reserved for those near death. Then the inside was anointed with chrism, the most precious of the holy oils, the same one used at the baptism and confirmation of Christians. And then incense was burned beneath it. and prayers were spoken over it. And finally, and this is the part I find genuinely moving, the bell was given a name: Mary, Peter, Jesus, John. Some bells were named after the saints of the parish. Some were named after the person who donated the funds to have them made. In England, a bell at Canterbury Cathedral was known as Dunstan, after the beloved Archbishop. Others had nicknames that the town gave them over generations: the dancer, the singer, old growler. These were not cute labels. These were identities. And the community that named a bell was also the community that believed with complete sincerity that the bell could hear. Now let me stop here, because I think this is the moment where a lot of people smile and think, oh, how charming, how naive. But I want to push back on that gently. Because when you look closely at what medieval people believed about bells, you start to realize it is not really about superstition at all. It is about something much more human. It is about the need to trust the things that protect you. Think about it this way. The bell was the single most important piece of infrastructure in a medieval town. More important than the well. More important than the mill. More important in many ways than the road. Because the bell was the voice of the community. It told you when to wake and when to sleep. It warned you when danger was coming. It marked the passing of everyone you loved. Of course, people personified it. Of course, they gave it a name and treated it with reverence. We do the same thing today. We name our cars. We talk to our plants. We feel genuine grief when a beloved building is demolished. The medieval relationship with bells was not primitive. It was deeply recognizably human. But here is the part of this story that absolutely stops me in my tracks every time I think about it. If a bell could be honoured, it could also be punished. And there are documented cases from medieval England that prove this beyond any doubt. When a bell fell from its tower, and this did occasionally happen given that these were enormous bronze objects suspended by rope and timber in structures that were not always as sturdy as they looked, and when that fall resulted in the death of a person below, the bell was put on trial. I am not speaking metaphorically. There are records from English parishes in the medieval period describing a formal process in which a bell that had caused a death was removed from its tower, turned upside down and filled with thorns and thistles. This punishment lasted 7 years. 7 years in disgrace, inverted, silent, dishonoured. And then if the community decided the bell had served its penance, it could be reconsecrated and returned to its place in the tower. There is something in that story that I have been thinking about for a long time, because it says something remarkable about how medieval people understood responsibility. They did not simply say the rope broke, it was an accident, move on. They said this object had power entrusted to it and it failed in its duty. And failure in a world where everyone depends on everyone else has consequences. Now let us talk about where all of this fits in the actual practical life of a medieval town. Because the theology and the ritual are fascinating, but what made bells truly revolutionary was the way they organized human time. And here is a concept I want you to understand because it is genuinely foreign to the way most of us think today. Medieval time was not fixed. This is so different from our experience that it takes a moment to really absorb. When we say 3 o'clock, we mean a precise universal internationally agreed upon moment in time. 3 o'clock in London is the same 3 o'clock as in Paris, give or take an hour for the time zone. It is a point on a grid, objective, measurable, unchanging. Medieval time was not like that at all. Medieval time breathed. The system that governed life in almost every monastery and town across Catholic Europe was based on what were called the canonical hours, a set of 8 prayer times drawn from the rule of St. Benedict written in the 6th century. These hours divided the day not into equal 60-minute segments, but into proportional shares of daylight and darkness. Which means that in summer, when the sun rose early and set late, the hours were long, In winter, when the days were short, the hours shrank. An hour in a medieval town in June in England might be 75 of our modern minutes. The same hour in December might be only 45. The clock, in other words, was not a fixed machine. It was a living thing that responded to the season, and the bells told you where you were inside it. Let me walk you through what a day actually sounded like. Long before sunrise in the cold darkness of early morning, the first bell rang. This was matins sometimes called the night office. Originally it was meant to be rung around 2 or 3 in the morning. In monasteries, monks rose from their beds in complete darkness to sing psalms and pray. For the townspeople sleeping nearby, this was often just a distant rumble in the night, a sound that filtered into dreams, a reminder that somewhere someone was already awake and speaking to God on their behalf. Then came Lauds just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten, the first birds, the smell of the fire being rekindled, then prime the first hour of the day, roughly what we would call 6 in the morning, and this was the bell that truly woke the working town. Shutters opened, bakers began to pull bread from their ovens, smiths kindled their forges, children were nudged out of their warmth and told to get moving, then terce around mid-morning, then sext, and here is where one of the most surprising linguistic gifts of the medieval world comes in. Sext was meant to be the 6th hour of the day. In the Roman system, the first hour was sunrise, so the 6th hour fell at what we would call noon. And this is where it gets delightfully complicated. Over the centuries, the monks began to ring the sext bell slightly earlier than they were supposed to. Nobody's entirely sure why. Some historians think it was because they were hungry and wanted to get to the midday meal sooner, which honestly is a motive I find very relatable. Whatever the reason, none, which was originally the 9th hour falling at mid-afternoon, gradually migrated earlier and earlier, until it fused with the midday hour entirely. And that is where the English word noon comes from. The word for 3 o'clock in the afternoon became the word for 12 o'clock midday because medieval monks wanted their lunch a little earlier. I think about that sometimes when someone says "see you at noon," and I wonder if they have any idea they are speaking a word shaped by a monastery's meal schedule in the 6th century. After none came vespers in the evening, the bell that told the working town to begin wrapping up. Tools were set down, animals were brought in, the market stalls began to close, and then finally, Compline. Compline was the last of the canonical hours, a short, quiet set of prayers sung at the very end of the day just before sleep. After Compline, the great silence of the monastery was supposed to begin. No talking, no movement, just rest and darkness. And for the town outside the monastery walls, the Compline bell carried the same message. The day is done, come home, be still. Now here is what I find so extraordinary about all of this. These 8 bells were not just a religious schedule, they were the operating system of an entire civilization. Think about what happens when the bells ring in a medieval town on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The prime bell rings. Thomas the baker, who has been up for an hour already, slides his first loaves into the oven and knows he has approximately 3 hours before the market bell rings and customers begin to arrive. The tanner on the edge of town begins soaking his hides. He knows that by sext they will need to be rinsed. The merchant who is travelling to the next town has arranged to meet his partner at the crossroads at terce. They do not need to agree on a clock time. They just need to be there when the bell rings. Both of them will hear it. The judge at the court of the local lord knows that hearings are supposed to begin at prime and conclude before vespers. Any matter that runs past the vespers bell will carry over to the next session. The labourer in the field knows he's paid by the canonical hour. His employer knows the same. If there is ever a dispute about how long he worked, they go to the bell. The bell is the record. The bell is the contract. The bell is the law. And I think that is the detail that most people, when they first encounter it, find genuinely startling. We think of time as a personal thing, my schedule, my calendar, my alarm. But for medieval people, time was fundamentally public. It was broadcast. It was shared. It was not something you owned. It was something the community decided together, and the mechanism by which the community decided was a bell with a name baptized with holy oil hanging in a tower of stone that everyone could see from every point in town. There is something almost beautiful about that, I think. And yet, here is the thing that the monks and the bishops and the town councils never entirely anticipated. The more bells organized daily life, the more powerful the bell became. And the more powerful the bell became, the more people wanted to control it. Because whoever controlled the bell controlled time itself. And controlling time, as it turns out, means controlling people. The story of how that power played out in the markets, in the streets, in the courtrooms of medieval Europe is exactly where we are headed next. Whoever controlled the bell controlled time itself. And controlling time, as we just said, means controlling people. So let us follow that thread. Because the story of what happened when bells met commerce, when sacred sound collided with human greed, with ambition, with the very basic desire to get ahead, is one of the most quietly dramatic stories of the entire medieval world. And it starts in a market square. Picture this. It is a Tuesday morning in the English town of Winchester, sometime in the middle of the 13th century. Winchester was at that time one of the most important trading cities in all of England. Its annual fair, the St. Giles Fair, held every September on the hill just east of the city walls, drew merchants from France, from Flanders, from Italy, from as far away as Spain. Cloth merchants, spice traders, wool buyers, money changers, and every single one of them on every single trading day was waiting for the same thing, the market bell. Because here is something that most people today do not realize about medieval commerce. It was not enough to simply show up with goods and a willing buyer. In most towns across England and continental Europe, buying and selling before the market bell rang was not just frowned upon, it was a crime. Let me be specific about this because the details matter. English towns and cities had by the 13th century developed extraordinarily detailed regulations around the timing of trade. These rules were encoded in town charters, official documents granted by the king or a local lord, and they were enforced with real consequences. In the City of London, regulations from around the year 1280 explicitly stated that no merchant was permitted to buy or sell certain goods, wool-cloth grain, before the ringing of the appropriate bell. Violation meant confiscation of the goods. Repeat violation could mean expulsion from the merchant guild. An expulsion from the guild in a medieval town was not simply a professional setback. It was social death. Your reputation gone. Your income gone. Your standing in the community gone. All because you tried to sell your wool 20 minutes too early. Now you might be wondering why. Why did medieval society care so intensely about when trade began? And the answer is one of those things that once you understand it, completely reframes the way you think about markets. The bell existed to create fairness. In a world without newspapers, without public announcements, without any of the information systems we take for granted, knowledge was power in the most literal possible sense. If you were a wealthy merchant with connections, you might know that a ship had just arrived in port carrying a large quantity of Flemish cloth. You might know this hours before your competitors, and if you were allowed to buy that cloth before the market bell rang, before the public trading day officially began, you could corner the supply drive up the price and extract profit from information that other people simply did not have access to. This practice had a name. It was called forestalling, and medieval communities despised it with a passion that I find genuinely admirable. Forestalling was not just considered dishonest, it was considered a form of theft from the community. Because the medieval marketplace was built on a principle idealistic perhaps, but sincerely held that trade should happen in the open, in public. where everyone could see the price, everyone could see the goods, and everyone had an equal chance to participate. The bell was the guardian of that principle. When it rang, the market was open, not a moment before. And this is where I want to share something that I think about quite often. There is a version of this story that you could tell dismissively. Medieval people with their bells and their superstitions regulating commerce in ways that seem quaint and inefficient. But when you look at what they were actually trying to do, create a level playing field, prevent information asymmetry from destroying fair trade, protect small sellers from being undercut by wealthy insiders who had advanced knowledge, that is not quaint at all. That is a problem we're still trying to solve. Every financial regulator in the modern world has rules against insider trading, against front-running, against the exact same thing that medieval merchants called forestalling. We just enforce it with computers and legal filings instead of a bronze bell. The medieval instinct, it turns out, was exactly right. The technology has changed. The problem has not. But the market bell did not only regulate when trade could begin, it also governed in remarkable detail what happened inside the market itself. And here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely surprising. In many medieval towns, the bell did not just ring once at the start of trading. It rang a second time, sometimes called the toll bell or the trading bell, to mark specific transitions in the market day. In some towns, the first bell opened trade to local sellers only. Townspeople, craftsmen, people who lived within the walls, they got first access to the market. Only after the second bell were outside, merchants, travelling traders, foreigners, people from other towns permitted to set up their stalls and begin selling. This was called the right of preemption, and it was considered one of the most valuable privileges a medieval town could hold. It meant that before any outside trader could sell a single loaf of bread or a single yard of cloth, the people of the town had already had the chance to buy what they needed at the best available prices. Think about what that meant for someone like our Baker Thomas. He did not just sell bread, he also bought grain. And if he could buy that grain before the large outside merchants arrived and drove up the prices, business survived another week. The bell in that moment was not just a timekeeping device, it was economic protection for the ordinary person. Now let us talk about what happened when the final bell rang. Because the closing of the medieval market was in its own way just as dramatic as the opening. When the market bell sounded for the last time in the afternoon at Vespers, usually or at a specific hour designated in the town charter, trading stopped. Immediately, not in a few minutes. Not, just let me finish this transaction. Immediately. Any deal that was not completed before the bell rang was void. Any price that had been agreed upon but not yet paid was unenforceable. Any goods that had been promised but not yet exchanged reverted to their original owner. The bell in legal terms drew a hard line across the day. Before it, commerce. After it, silence. And I find that fascinating because it tells you something profound about how medieval people understood the relationship between time and legitimacy. Time for them was not just a backdrop against which events happened. Time was itself a legal actor. The moment the bell rang, the law changed, not because a judge had ruled, not because a contract had expired, simply because the sound had occurred. Sound as law. I have never quite gotten over that idea. There was another category of bell-regulated commerce that I want to tell you about because it involves one of the most colourful and least known characters of medieval town life, the regrator. A regrator was someone who bought goods inside the market at the market price after the bell, and then immediately resold them at a higher price within the same market on the same day. We would recognize this today as perfectly normal retail behavior. Buy wholesale, sell retail. That is just business. But medieval communities viewed it very differently. The regrator was in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of most townspeople a parasite. Someone who added no value produced, nothing grew, nothing made nothing, and yet inserted themselves between the producer and the consumer to skim off a profit. Town ordinances across England and France from the 12th through the 15th centuries are full of regulations specifically targeting regrators. In some towns they were banned entirely from certain markets. In others they were required to wait until the closing bell before they could resell anything they had purchased. The logic was the same as the logic against forestalling. The market exists to serve the community. If you are using it purely to enrich yourself at the expense of others, the bell will not protect you. Now here is a question I want to throw out to you if you're still awake and thinking. Do any of these ideas feel familiar? Because when I read through the medieval ordinances about forestalling and regrating, when I see the detailed, passionate arguments that medieval town councils made about why markets needed rules and time limits and bells to enforce them, I keep thinking about how little has actually changed. The names are different, the technology is different, but the core argument that markets left entirely to themselves tend to favour those with the most information and the most resources, and that some form of external structure is needed to keep them honest. That argument is as alive today as it was in Winchester in 1250. And somehow it took me learning about medieval bells to really feel the weight of it. But commerce was only one dimension of what bells controlled. Because while the market bell was governing trade and protecting buyers, another bell entirely was doing something just as important and far more intimate. This bell was not about money. It was about survival. Specifically, it was about the danger of fire. And the story of this bell, what it was called, why it existed, and what a person could lose if they ignored it, is one of those stories that sounds almost too dramatic to be true, until you realize that for hundreds of years it was simply daily life. Let me set the scene. It is 8 o'clock in the evening, the market is closed, the streets of the medieval town are narrowing into shadow, and somewhere above you in the bell tower you can see from every window in your house a single bell begins to ring. Slow, deliberate, insistent, and every person in the town knows exactly what they have to do next. They have to cover their fire. The word curfew, one of the most common words in the English language, a word you've almost certainly used yourself, carries inside it the entire history of what we are about to explore. It comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, cover fire, and in a world built entirely of wood, thatch and timber, a world where the walls of your house, the roof above your head, the floor beneath your feet and the furniture you owned were all made of material that could ignite in seconds, those two words were not a quaint expression. They were a matter of life and death. Consider what medieval fire actually meant. In the year 1069, a fire set by Norman soldiers in York spread so quickly and so completely that it reached the great minster itself, melting the bronze bells in the tower and destroying records and structures that had stood for generations. In London, fires were so frequent and so devastating throughout the medieval period that city authorities eventually began keeping detailed records of every major outbreak. Entire neighbourhoods, dozens of houses, workshops, stalls could vanish in an evening. The Great Fire of London in 1666, which most people know about, was dramatic precisely because it was larger than usual. But the truth is that London had been burning neighbourhood by neighbourhood for 500 years before that. And the curfew bell was the answer when William the Conqueror consolidated his control over England after his victory in the year 1066. One of his earliest administrative acts was to impose a kingdom-wide curfew. Every evening when the bell rang at 8 o'clock, every household in England was required by law to extinguish or cover their fire. The regulation was enforced with fines. In some areas, persistent violators could be imprisoned. And I want to be clear about what cover your fire actually meant in practical terms. because it is not as simple as blowing out a candle. Medieval homes were heated and cooked on open hearths, stone-lined pits, or raised platforms in the centre of the main room over which the family's fire burned continuously, sometimes for days or weeks without fully going out. To comply with the curfew bell, you took a device called a couvre-feu, a dome-shaped cover usually made of metal or pottery, and placed it over the glowing coals. This did not extinguish the fire, it smothered it, kept the embers alive but contained unable to throw sparks, unable to catch on anything. By morning, when the morning bell rang, you could lift the cover and coax the coals back to life. The fire was never fully lost. It was simply put to sleep, just like the town. There is something in that image that I keep coming back to. The fire sleeping under its dome, the town sleeping in its houses, the bell having spoken its last word for the day. In our time, we think of silence as an absence, the end of sound, the end of activity. But in a medieval town, the silence after the curfew bell was something much more intentional. It was maintained, it was enforced, it was in a very real sense a collective choice that the entire community made together every single evening at the sound of a bell. After the curfew bell rang, the city gates were locked. The night watch took to the streets, local citizens serving their civic duty, carrying lanterns and long poles. Anyone found outdoors after the curfew bell without a legitimate reason was by definition a suspect. Not because the law assumed the worst of everyone, but because the law understood what darkness combined with fire and close-packed wooden buildings actually meant. The risk was not theoretical. The risk was the smouldering memory of every neighbourhood that had not survived the night. And yet, and this is the part of the story that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets, not everyone was locked inside after the curfew bell. There were exceptions, and the exceptions tell us almost as much about medieval society as the rule itself. Physicians were permitted to travel after curfew. Midwives were permitted. The clergy were permitted. In some towns, members of certain trade guilds, the Guild of Goldsmiths for example, or the Guild of Surgeons, carried official tokens or seals that allowed them to be on the street after dark. The night watch knew these tokens, knew these faces, and in a town of a few thousand people where most residents had lived their entire lives within the same set of streets that personal recognition was itself a kind of system. You knew your neighbours knew you, and the bell had drawn the line between the world of the known and the world of the unknown. After curfew, anyone unfamiliar was by definition worth questioning. I want to pause here and just acknowledge something, because I know that some of what I have described, the monitoring, the restrictions on movement, the assumption of suspicion after dark, can sound to modern ears deeply uncomfortable, and I think that discomfort is worth sitting with. Because the medieval curfew was not designed as an instrument of control for its own sake. It was designed as an instrument of shared survival. The people who enforced it were not strangers. They were neighbours doing their civic duty. The people who obeyed it were not subjects being kept in line. They were members of a community that understood from direct experience how quickly everything could be lost. That does not make every aspect of it admirable. Power, as we will see in this story, has a way of expanding beyond its original purpose. But it does make it understandable. And I think that is the real work of history, not to judge the past by the standards of the present, but to understand why people made the choices they made given the world they actually lived in. The curfew bell survived in many parts of England long after the legal requirement to cover fires had faded. In the town of Sandwich in Kent, one of the ancient Cinque Ports of medieval England, the curfew bell known as the pig bell, hanging in St. Peter's Church, has been rung every evening at 8 o'clock for nearly 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Every evening, without significant interruption, a bell has rung in that tower to mark the end of the day. The fire ordinance that created it is long gone. The legal authority behind it has dissolved. The medieval town it once protected has transformed beyond recognition. And yet the bell still rings. Because somewhere along the way the purpose of the bell shifted. It was no longer about fire safety. It was about memory, about continuity, about the feeling that something fundamental, some rhythm of the day, some shared acknowledgement that the evening has come was worth preserving, simply because it connected the living to the thousands of generations who had heard the same sound before them. A community choosing to remember every single evening at the sound of a bell, and that the idea that bells do not just organize time but carry it, is the thread that leads us directly to the most intimate, the most personal, the most emotionally charged use of bells in the entire medieval world. Because while the market bell governed commerce and the curfew bell governed safety, there was a third bell, one that spoke not to the crowd, not to the merchant, not to the night watch, but to the individual, to the person lying in a bed surrounded by people who loved them, hearing their own breaths low, and to every neighbour within earshot who would stop whatever they were doing, bow their heads, and whisper a prayer for a soul they might not even know by name. That bell had a name too, and the language it spoke was unlike anything else in the medieval world. The passing bell, that's what they called it. And if you had lived in any town or village in medieval England or France or Germany or anywhere across the wide reach of Catholic Europe, you would have known the moment you heard it exactly what it meant. Not because someone told you, not because you read it somewhere, but because you had heard it before, probably many times. And each time you heard it, you stopped what you were doing, turned toward the sound and said a quiet prayer for whoever was slipping away on the other side of it. Let me take you into that world for a moment. It is a grey afternoon in the English city of Canterbury sometime in the early 14th century. A woman named Agnes is dying. She's not young, she's lived perhaps 50 years, which in the medieval world is a long life, a good life. Her family is gathered around her in the small upper room of a timber house on a lane not far from the cathedral. Her breathing has changed. The priest has already come and gone administering the last rites, and now someone in the household, a son perhaps, or a neighbour, who has been watching through the night, walks to the church, speaks a few words to the sexton, and a few moments later, from high in the stone tower above the city, a bell begins to ring, slowly, evenly, with a heaviness that seems to come from somewhere deeper than metal. One stroke, a pause, another stroke, another pause. Everyone in the city hears it. The baker pauses at his oven. The merchant at the market looks up from his scales. The children playing in the street go quiet for a moment, because this is not the market bell, and it is not the canonical hours bell, and it is not any bell they might confuse with something routine. This is the passing bell, and it means that somewhere in this city a soul is preparing to leave the world. The passing bell had a very specific purpose. It was rung while the dying person was still alive, not after, while. And the reason for this, the theological reasoning behind it, tells you something remarkable about how medieval people understood the relationship between sound and the spiritual world. They believed with complete sincerity that the ringing of a bell could protect the departing soul. From what? From the demons that medieval theology taught were present at the moment of death. The thinking went something like this. Death was not a private moment. It was a threshold, a crossing point between two worlds, and at that threshold forces gathered. The bell's sound, having been blessed and consecrated at its baptism, carried a kind of spiritual authority. It purified the air through which the sound travelled. It drove back the darkness. It created, in a sense, a corridor of safety through which the soul could pass. This is why the passing bell was rung continuously, not in quick bursts, but in slow, steady, deliberate strokes, for as long as the person was in the process of dying, which could be hours. The bell ringer in those hours was not simply performing a task, he was standing guard. Now here is the part of this story that I find genuinely extraordinary. The passing bell was not free, it was paid for. If a family wanted the bells rung for their dying relative, and most families did, because the alternative was to let your loved one face that crossing without protection, they had to compensate the bell ringer and in many cases make a formal payment to the church. The wealthier the family, the more bells they could afford to have rung. A very wealthy patron might have every bell in the tower sounding for hours. A poor family might afford only the single smallest bell rung for a short time. But here is what strikes me most about this. Churches kept records of these payments, detailed, careful records. And when historians have examined those records, and some of them have digging through centuries of parish accounts, what they find is that even very poor families that had almost nothing, consistently found a way to pay for at least some ringing. Because this was not optional, not socially, not spiritually. To die without the passing bell was in the medieval imagination to be sent into darkness without a lantern, and no family, however poor, could bring themselves to do that to someone they loved. But the passing bell was only the beginning. Because in medieval England, death did not have just one bell, it had 3. And each bell marked a different stage of a journey that the community travelled together with the dying person and their family. The first was the passing bell rung while the person still breathed. The second was the death knell rung at the moment death was confirmed. And the third was the lich bell, sometimes called the corpse bell rung, as the funeral procession moved through the streets toward the church. 3 bells, 3 moments, a single community holding a single person through the entire passage from life to burial. Let me tell you about the death knell specifically because the way it was rung contained a language all its own. When the passing bell finally fell silent, when the family sent word to the sexton that the person had gone, the bell began again. But differently, in most parishes across England, the death knell was rung in a pattern that communicated to anyone listening specific information about the person who had died. The system worked like this: 3 strokes followed by a pause, 3 strokes followed by a pause, 3 strokes followed by a pause. Those 9 strokes, 3 times 3, told the town a man has died. If the pattern was 3 strokes, pause, 3 strokes, pause, only 6 strokes, total 3 times 2, that told the town a woman has died. And then after the initial announcement, the bell continued striking once for each year of the person's life. 20 strokes, 30 strokes, 50, 60, each slow toll a year remembered. Sit with that for a moment. Imagine standing in the street of a medieval town hearing a bell begin to ring its message. 9 strokes, a man. Then the counting begins. 1, 2, 3. And you are listening, and the whole street is listening, and without a word being spoken, without a messenger being sent, you know that a man has died. 20 strokes, 30, 40. At 40, you start to think someone middle-aged, someone with children probably, someone whose face you might recognize at the market. 50, 55. The bell stops, and in the quiet that follows you bow your head. Because John Donne, the English poet and clergyman writing in the early 17th century, reflecting on a tradition that had already been alive for hundreds of years before him, captured it perfectly when he wrote that no person is an island entire unto itself, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That line was not a metaphor when Donne wrote it. It was a description of something that happened every day, in every town, in every community across England. A bell rang, everyone listened, and everyone understood that the diminishing of one life diminished all of them. There is a question I want to ask you here, and I want you to actually think about it for a moment. When was the last time an entire community paused together for an individual death? Not a famous person, not a public figure, just someone ordinary, a baker, a merchant, a grandmother on a quiet street. When did your neighbourhood last stop together for someone like that? I am not asking to make anyone feel sad. I am asking because I think the answer tells us something important about what we have gained and what we have lost in the centuries since those bells last fell silent. Now the lich bell, the third bell in this sequence, deserves its own moment. The word lich comes from the Old English word for body or corpse, and the lich bell was rung as the physical body was carried through the streets to the churchyard. In most medieval towns, the route of the funeral procession was itself a kind of community ritual. The body wrapped and carried on a bier was brought out through the door of the house where the person had lived. The procession moved slowly, deliberately slowly through the streets of the neighbourhood, past the places the person had known, past the market where they had bought and sold, past the well where they had drawn water, past the houses of their neighbours who came to their doorways and stood in silence as the procession passed. The bell rang throughout, slow and steady, marking each step of the final journey through the world the person had inhabited, and then the gates of the churchyard and the earth and silence. Here is something that many people do not know about the geography of medieval death. In most towns, the churchyard was not separate from daily life. It was not a distant, walled-off place that people avoided. It was in many cases right at the centre of town. The church stood in the market square or adjacent to it. The churchyard wrapped around it, and people walked through the churchyard or around its edge as part of their ordinary daily movements. The graves were there, the markers were there, and the sound of the lich bell moving through those narrow streets brought you face to face with the fact of those graves in a way that was inescapable. Medieval people were not morbid, but they were honest. They understood death not as an interruption to life, but as a part of it, a destination that everyone was moving toward at different speeds from different directions. The bells simply made that understanding audible. There is one more layer to the story of death and bells that I want to tell you about, because it involves money and status and the very human tendency to use grief as a form of display. By the later medieval period, the 14th and 15th centuries especially, the ringing of bells for the dead had become in many wealthy parishes genuinely elaborate. When a powerful nobleman or a wealthy merchant died, his family might commission not just the local church bells, but the bells of multiple churches across the town to ring simultaneously. The sound would be overwhelming. Layers of bronze voices, each from a different tower, overlapping and echoing across the rooftops. You would not just hear that someone important had died, you would feel it in your chest. Records from London in the 14th century describe arrangements in which wealthy testators, people writing their will, specified exactly how many bells they wanted, rung at their funeral for how long from how many towers, and how much money was set aside to pay for it. One documented case from a wealthy London merchant in the middle of the 14th century specified that the bells of 5 different parish churches were to ring simultaneously for a full hour following his death. 5 churches, 1 hour. The whole city vibrating with the announcement of one man's passing. Now, does that sound like pure piety to you? Or does it sound a little bit like a man who even in death wanted to make absolutely certain that everyone knew he had been important? I suspect it was both. And I think that is something about human nature that has not changed at all. But there is a counterweight to all of this wealth and display, and it sits at the very heart of what made the bells of death truly powerful. Because while the rich could afford more bells and louder bells and bells from more towers, the bell itself did not discriminate. When the passing bell rang for Agnes, the ordinary woman on her narrow lane in Canterbury, it rang with the same slowness, the same weight, the same deliberateness as it rang for any nobleman in his manor. The sound was the same. and everyone who heard it stopped the same way, bowed their heads the same way, said their prayer the same way. In a world deeply stratified by rank and wealth and birth, a world where your place in the social order was visible in everything from the clothes you wore to the seat you occupied in the church, the passing bell was one of the very few things that treated everyone as equal. You came into the world without bells, you left it with them. And for however many strokes the bell counted out your years, the entire community stood still and witnessed your life. Every single one of them, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest labourer, all listening, all pausing, all present. There is a reason that John Donne's words have endured for 400 years, a reason they are still quoted, still felt, still reach something deep in whoever reads them. It is because the tradition they described was not abstract. It was a daily physical, audible experience of what it means to be part of something larger than yourself. The bell rang, and you knew, not who had died, not yet, but that someone had, and that someone mattered. Now we have followed the bell from the sacred to the commercial to the final hours of a human life. But there is one dimension of the bell's power we have not yet touched, and it may be the one that shaped daily life most immediately, most viscerally, most urgently. Because all the bells we've talked about so far, the market bell, the curfew bell, the passing bell, they all asked something of you slowly. They gave you time to respond, time to think, time to adjust. But there was one bell that gave you no time at all. One bell that the moment it rang made every person within earshot run. Not walk, not gather, not pause and reflect. Run. And the reason they ran is the same reason your heart rate jumps when you hear a fire alarm today. Because that bell meant that everything you owned and possibly everyone you loved was in danger of disappearing before the next sunrise. That story is coming right now. Fire. That is where we begin. Not the cosy controlled fire of a hearth on a winter evening. Not the candle flame you carry up the stairs to bed. The kind of fire that starts in one corner of a thatched roof at 2 a.m. and becomes within the span of a single hour a wall of moving flame consuming everything in its path. The kind of fire that medieval people feared more than almost anything else on earth. And the bell that warned of it, the alarm bell, the tocsin, the great clanging voice of panic and urgency, was as different from the passing bell or the market bell as a scream is from a whisper. Let me give you a number that I think will make this real, in a way that no general description can. In the year 1135, a single fire in the city of London destroyed approximately 1,000 houses. 1,000 houses. In a city where the total population was perhaps 20,000 people. Think about what that means proportionally. If a city of 300,000 people lost 1,000 houses today, we would call it a catastrophe. We would mobilize emergency services from across the country. It would be on every news channel for weeks. In medieval London, fires of that scale happened multiple times per century. The city burned in 1135. It burned again in 1161, again in 1176, again in 1212. And between those great recorded fires there were hundreds of smaller ones. Neighbourhood fires, street fires, workshop fires that consumed a dozen houses here, 20 houses there, and were simply absorbed into the ordinary risk of daily life. This was the world the alarm bell existed to serve. Now I want to be precise about something because the alarm bell is often confused with the curfew bell in popular accounts of medieval history. They were not the same thing. The curfew bell was planned, scheduled, anticipated. It rang at the same time every evening and its message was routine cover. Your fires go indoors, the day is done. The alarm bell, sometimes called the tocsin from the old French word meaning to strike a sign, was the opposite of routine. It rang without warning, at any hour, in any weather, and its message was not calm. Its message was something is wrong right now, and you need to act immediately. The sound itself was different. Where the passing bell moved slowly and heavily, one stroke, a long pause, another stroke. The tocsin was rapid and irregular, frantic almost, struck as fast as the ringer could pull the rope. And because the human ear is remarkably good at distinguishing urgency from calm, we are wired for it. It is one of the oldest survival instincts we have. Everyone who heard it understood the difference immediately. No training required, no explanation needed. That sound meant danger. Run toward it if you can help. Run away from it if you cannot. But do not stand still. Here is something that I find fascinating about the mechanics of how the alarm bell actually worked. In larger medieval towns, the bell tower was not just a housing for bells. It was also a watchtower. Many bell towers across England and France had by the 13th century designated positions near the upper windows where a watch could be kept throughout the night. These watchmen sometimes paid civic employees. Sometimes citizens serving their obligatory turn scanned the rooftops and streets below for the first sign of fire. The moment they spotted smoke or the first orange glow of a flame catching in a thatched roof, they did not go down the stairs to alert someone. They reached for the bell rope right there. Because every second mattered. Every second between the first spark and the first alarm was a second in which the fire was spreading through dry wood and straw, and every second of spreading made it exponentially harder to stop. The watchman's job was simple and enormous at the same time. See the fire, ring the bell, do not stop ringing until someone responds. But here is the part of this story that most people have never thought about. What happened after the bell rang? We talk about medieval firefighting as if it were primitive and disorganized, a crowd of panicking people throwing buckets of water at a wall of flame, and sometimes it was that. But in many well-organized medieval towns, the alarm bell triggered something far more structured than a panicked mob. It triggered a system. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, towns across England and France had developed what we might recognize today as proto-firefighting codes. London had regulations recorded in civic documents from the reign of King Richard I in the 1190s, requiring that every ward of the city maintain specific firefighting equipment at all times. Hooks. Long poles with iron hooks at the end used to pull burning thatch off rooftops and away from neighbouring buildings. Chains used to form human lines passing buckets of water from the nearest river or well. Ladders for reaching upper floors and rooftops, and axes. Used for a technique that sounds counterintuitive, but was genuinely effective, deliberately pulling down houses in the path of an advancing fire to create a gap it could not jump. Controlled demolition, in the year 1200, triggered by a bell. The social dynamics of medieval firefighting are, I think, one of the least appreciated aspects of how these communities actually functioned. Because fighting a fire in a medieval town was not a professional activity. It was a civic obligation. When the alarm bell rang, every able-bodied person in the surrounding streets was expected to respond. Not invited, expected. Town regulations from this period are remarkably direct about this. In a number of English towns, failure to respond to the fire bell without a legitimate excuse was a finable offence. You heard the bell, you came. That was the agreement. And this speaks to something I find genuinely moving about medieval urban life, something that gets lost when we focus only on the hardships and the limitations. These were communities of real mutual dependence. When your neighbour's house was burning, it was not just their problem. Because your house was 10 feet away, made of the same wood under the same kind of thatched roof. Their fire was your fire. And the bell was the moment at which that mutual dependence became audible. Now I want to tell you about a specific event that I think illustrates all of this more vividly than any general description can. The year is 1212. London is burning. The fire started on the south bank of the Thames in the area called Southwark and was driven northward by a strong wind. It reached the wooden bridge that crossed the Thames-London Bridge in its medieval timber, former structure lined with houses and shops on both sides, essentially a village built over a river. Thousands of people rushed to the bridge to watch the fire or to help, or simply because the noise and the light drew them there the way disaster always draws human beings. And while they were crowded on that bridge, the fire reached both ends simultaneously. There was no way off. Contemporary accounts recorded by monks and chroniclers writing in the decades following describe people jumping into the Thames boats, rushing to rescue those in the water, the screaming of those who could not be reached. Hundreds died. And in the surviving records of that event, one detail keeps appearing: the bells. Multiple chroniclers mention the sound of the bells ringing across the city, the alarm bells from different parishes overlapping and combining into something that people described as unlike any sound they had ever heard. Not musical, not rhythmic, just urgent, continuous, everywhere at once. One monk writing about the fire described it as sounding like the voice of the city itself crying out. I do not know exactly what that sounded like, but I think I understand what he meant. Let me tell you about another dimension of the alarm bell that goes beyond fire. Because fire was not the only danger that a medieval town faced. There was also the alarm for flood. England, France, and the Low Countries, the densely populated river towns and coastal settlements of northern Europe, lived in genuine constant relationship with the risk of water. The Thames flooded regularly in the medieval period. The rivers of Flanders flooded so frequently that the communities along them developed some of the most sophisticated water management systems in medieval Europe. And in those communities, the alarm bell for flooding had its own distinctive character. Because unlike fire, which was fast and violent and demanded instant action, a flood was often a slower threat, something you had time to respond to if you responded immediately. So the flood alarm was rung differently, slower than the fire tocsin, but faster than the passing bell, a middle rhythm that meant you have time but not much of it. Get your animals to higher ground, move your grain stores, reinforce the walls, come and help your neighbours do the same. The community knew the difference. They had grown up with these sounds. They were in a very real sense fluent in the language of bells. And this brings me to something that I genuinely believe does not get enough attention in how we talk about medieval history. We tend to assume that people in the past were less informed than us, less aware, less capable of processing complex information quickly. But look at what medieval townspeople actually knew. They could identify from the sound of a bell alone whether they were being called to prayer or to market or to civic duty or to mourn a neighbour or to fight a fire or to flee a flood. They could distinguish from the rhythm and speed of the ringing how urgent the situation was. They could determine from the pattern of the death knell the sex and approximate age of the person who had died. They were processing a sophisticated multi-channel information system entirely acoustic, entirely real-time that required years of embedded cultural knowledge to read correctly. That is not primitive. That is a form of literacy, an acoustic literacy, a community literacy, a kind of intelligence that we, with all our screens and notifications and algorithms, have almost entirely lost. I want to pause here and ask you something that I have been thinking about as I put this story together. We talk a lot today about information overload, about the constant noise of notifications and alerts and updates competing for our attention, and there is a real cost to that. Studies consistently show that the constant interruption of digital alerts raises our stress levels, fragments our concentration, and makes it harder for us to be fully present in any single moment. Now compare that to the medieval experience. In a medieval town, the bells were the information system, And yes, there were multiple bells with multiple meanings, but each bell was clear, each bell was shared, each bell asked for exactly one response. You heard the passing bell, you said a prayer. You heard the market bell, you went to trade. You heard the tocsin, you grabbed a bucket. There was no ambiguity, no choice paralysis. No wondering whether this notification was important enough to interrupt what you were doing. The bell told you, the community had already decided, and you simply responded. I am not romanticizing the medieval world. Life then was genuinely hard in ways I would not wish on anyone. But there is something about the clarity of that system, the way it organized collective attention around shared priorities, that I find myself thinking about more than I expected when I first started exploring this story. Now the alarm bell had one more use that we have not yet talked about. One that was not about fire or flood, but about something that struck medieval communities with a different kind of terror entirely. Enemy armies, the invasion bell. In England, France, and across the borderlands of medieval Europe, towns under threat of attack had their own bell signals, sometimes called the alarm peal, sometimes simply the war bells. These were rung in patterns so distinctive that even someone sleeping deeply in a house on the far edge of town would wake up and know immediately that this was not a fire, not a flood, not a death. This was an army. The gates needed to close. The men needed to arm. The women and children needed to find shelter. The valuables needed to be hidden. All of this triggered by the sound of a bell. In the border regions of Scotland and England, where raids were a genuine and frequent reality, throughout the medieval period, communities developed elaborate bell protocols that could communicate not just danger but direction. A peal beginning from the North Tower meant the threat was coming from the north. A peal from the South Tower meant the opposite. The bell was in that context not just an alarm, it was a map, a directional warning system built from sound alone. There is one final detail about the alarm bell that I want to leave you with, because it involves a phrase that survives in English to this day, and that most people use without having any idea where it came from. The phrase is ringing the bells backward. In medieval and early modern England, one of the ways to signal extreme alarm fire invasion catastrophe was to begin the peal not with the highest, lightest bell, as was normal for regular ringing, but with the heaviest, deepest bell first, backward from the usual order. A sound so wrong, so contrary to the familiar pattern, that anyone who heard it knew immediately that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Shakespeare uses the phrase in his play King John, written in the 1590s, as a signal of disaster. The Oxford English Dictionary records the expression as far back as the early 16th century, and it is still used today, though most people who say ringing alarm bells or backward bells have no idea they're reaching back to a practice that was for hundreds of years one of the most important emergency signals in the entire English-speaking world. Language like bells carries the past inside it, long after the original meaning has faded from memory, so we have followed the bells through the most dramatic moments of medieval life, the commercial drama of the market square, the intimate sorrow of the passing bell, the raw urgency of the alarm tocsin, and in each case what we find is the same thing, a community using sound to think together, to act together, to survive together. But there is one person we have barely mentioned in this story, one person without whom none of these bells would have rung at all, one person who sat at the centre of the entire system, who carried in their hands and their memory the keys to the acoustic world of the medieval town, the bell ringer, and the story of who these people actually were, their status, their knowledge, their responsibility, and the extraordinary power they held over daily life is far more surprising than you might expect. That is exactly where we are headed next. Think about the most important job in your city right now. Maybe you think of the mayor, maybe a hospital administrator, maybe the person who keeps the power grid running. Now imagine that the entire rhythm of daily life, when people woke, when they worked, when they traded, when they mourned, when they ran for their lives, depended entirely on one person remembering to do their job correctly every single day, without fail, before sunrise and after sunset, in rain and cold and illness and grief. That person existed in every medieval town in Europe, and almost no one today knows their name: the sexton. That was the most common English title for the person responsible for the bells of a parish church. The word itself comes from the Latin sacristanus, the keeper of sacred things, and sacred things in a medieval parish included the vestments and vessels used in the Mass, the keys to the church building, the maintenance of the churchyard, and above all the bells. But sexton undersells what this person actually was. In practical terms, the sexton of a medieval parish was the operational heartbeat of the community, not the priest who held the spiritual authority, not the mayor or the lord who held the political authority. The sexton, the person who climbed the tower stairs before first light, who pulled the ropes at exactly the right moment, who carried in his hands and, more importantly, in his memory, the entire acoustic schedule by which the town lived. Let me tell you what a sexton's day actually looked like, because I think when most people imagine medieval bell ringing, they picture something simple: a person pulling a rope, a bell swinging, end of story. The reality was considerably more demanding. In a parish with multiple bells, and by the 13th century many English parish churches had 3, 4, 5 or even more bells of different sizes, the sexton was responsible for knowing not just when to ring, but how to ring. Different occasions required different bells, different rhythms, different combinations. The small treble bell for the Sanctus during Mass the moment the consecrated bread was lifted above the altar, so that even those outside the church walls could pause and acknowledge it. The larger bells for the canonical hours, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, each one timed with enough precision that merchants, workers and judges could organize their days around it. The tenor bell always the heaviest, always the deepest in tone for the passing bell tolling slowly for the dying. And the full peal, all the bells together in coordinated sequence for feast days, for coronations, for the great celebrations of the liturgical year. Each of these was a distinct performance. Each required specific knowledge, specific timing, specific physical technique. The sexton had to know all of them, and he had to execute them correctly every time without a score in front of him and without the luxury of a second take. Now here is something that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The sexton was paid, not as an act of charity, not as a minor honorarium, paid as a skilled professional, because that is exactly what he was. Records from medieval parishes across England show that sextons received regular wages, sometimes supplemented by additional fees for specific services like ringing the passing bell or participating in a funeral. In London, where the demands on bell ringers were greater than almost anywhere else in the country, the position of chief bell ringer at a major church was considered a respectable and reasonably well compensated occupation. And as we touched on earlier in this story, historical records from cathedral cities in Spain and Catalonia, where similar bell-ringing positions existed, show that ringers could earn 8 to 10 small coins per day for their services. To put that in context, a day labourer in the same period earned roughly the same amount, sometimes less. So the bell ringer was not a servant sweeping up after the clergy. He was a specialist, a craftsman of sound, compensated accordingly. But compensation alone does not capture what made the sexton's position so remarkable. What made it truly extraordinary was the knowledge it required. And here is where I want to tell you something that most people, even people who are genuinely interested in medieval history, have never really thought about. The sexton was in a very real sense the keeper of time for the entire town. Not metaphorically, literally. Before mechanical clocks became common in Europe, and that transition happened slowly beginning in the late 13th century and spreading gradually through the 14th, the sexton's judgment about when to ring was the town's clock. He read the sky, the angle of the sun, the quality of the light, the position of certain stars at night. He used a sundial when it was available and reliable. He used a candle clock or a water clock in poorer light, and then he added something that no mechanical instrument could provide: experience. A sexton who had served a parish for 20 years knew in his bones what 4 o'clock in the morning felt like in December, what noon felt like in the middle of summer, what the specific quality of the sky looked like just before the prime bell should ring. That knowledge lived inside him. It was not written down anywhere that the town could easily access. It was not transferable at a moment's notice. It was his, and that made him quietly one of the most powerful figures in any medieval community. I want to pause here and ask you to think about something. In the modern world, we tend to assume that power follows wealth or title or fame. The person with the most money has the most influence. The person with the biggest platform has the most reach. But medieval society was full of examples, the sexton being one of them, where power attached itself to something different, to indispensability. The sexton was not wealthy. He did not have a title of nobility. He did not command armies or collect taxes. But if he failed to do his job, if he overslept or fell ill, or made an error in his timing, the entire town felt it immediately. Markets opened at the wrong moment. Workers showed up at the wrong hour. The dying were not accompanied by the passing bell. The fire alarm was delayed. The sexton's failure was everyone's problem. And in a world where everyone could see that fact clearly, where the consequences of the bell ringer's absence were immediate and visible and shared, that person commanded a kind of respect that did not need a title attached to it. He simply had to be there. He simply had to be right, and everyone knew it. There is a particular dimension of the sexton's responsibilities that I find both fascinating and somewhat vertiginous when I really think about it. The sexton was legally accountable for his ringing, not morally accountable, not professionally accountable, legally. Town records and church documents from the medieval period contain references to cases where a bell ringer was held, responsible for ringing at the wrong time, opening the market too early, or sounding the curfew too late, or failing to ring the alarm quickly enough when fire was spotted. The degree of accountability varied by location and by the specific circumstances, but the underlying principle was consistent. The bell was not just a sound. It was an official announcement, and the person who made that announcement bore responsibility for its accuracy. Think about what that means. Every time a sexton pulled that rope, he was making a statement on behalf of the entire community. He was saying, this is the moment, this is the hour, act accordingly. If he was wrong, people made decisions based on wrong information. Merchants showed up to a market that was not yet legally open. Workers arrived at the wrong time and disputed their wages. A dying person's family sat waiting for the passing bell that never came. The weight of that responsibility resting on the shoulders of one ordinary person, ringing a bell in a stone tower, while the rest of the town slept or worked or grieved, is something I find genuinely moving. Now let's talk about what happened when the job of bell ringing grew beyond one person's capacity. Because as towns grew larger in the 12th and 13th centuries, as the great cathedrals of England and France acquired more and more bells, each one heavier and more complex to ring than the last, the single sexton was no longer enough. Enter the bell ringers' guild. In larger cities, particularly in the Low Countries and in England, organised groups of bell ringers began to form around major churches and cathedrals. These were not casual associations. They were genuine guilds with formal membership, apprenticeship structures, rules of conduct and standards of practice. An apprentice bell ringer in a cathedral city might spend several years learning the craft before he was permitted to ring the great tenor bell on his own, and the craft was genuinely demanding. Ringing a large medieval bell required significant physical strength. Some of the great tenor bells weighed 2 tons or more, and controlling the arc of their swing while maintaining a precise rhythm was a skill that took years to develop. But it also required something less obvious. It required the ability to listen. Because the mark of a skilled bell ringer was not just the ability to ring his own bell correctly. It was the ability to ring in relationship to the other bells around him. Multiple bells, multiple ringers, each one listening to the others, each one adjusting their rhythm in real time to create a sound that was organized rather than chaotic. This is the art form that would eventually develop in England, particularly into the extraordinary practice of change, ringing the mathematical permutation of bell sequences that became one of the most complex acoustic arts in the world. But even in its simpler medieval form, it required something that I think we undervalue in our modern understanding of this history. It required musicians, not formally trained musicians perhaps, but people with a genuine ear for sound, a genuine sensitivity to timing, a genuine commitment to the collective result, rather than their individual contribution. The bell ringers of a great medieval cathedral were in the truest sense an ensemble, and here is where the story takes a turn that I did not expect when I first started researching it. The bell ringers of medieval Europe were not universally beloved. They were respected, depended upon, often well compensated. But they were also at times the subject of intense frustration negotiation and outright conflict with the religious and civic authorities above them. Because the bell ringers knew something that those authorities found deeply uncomfortable. They knew that without them the system stopped. And they were not above using that knowledge. Records from cathedral chapters, the governing bodies of medieval cathedrals, are full of references to disputes with bell ringers over wages, over working conditions, over the number of occasions on which they were expected to ring without additional pay. In some cases, bell ringers went on what we might today recognize as strikes refusing to ring for a particular ceremony until their grievances were addressed. In one documented case from a French cathedral in the later medieval period, the canons, the senior clergy, had to negotiate directly with the bell ringers guild before a major feast day because the ringers refused to perform the full ceremonial peal until a payment dispute was resolved. The feast day waited. The bells were silent and the canons paid. I find that story quietly wonderful, because it punctures a certain romantic idea about medieval hierarchy, the idea that power always flowed cleanly from the top down, that ordinary people simply obeyed, that the great and important always got what they wanted from the humble and practical. The bell ringers of medieval Europe were not by any social measure important people. They did not sit at the high table. They did not hold political office. They did not appear in chronicles except in passing references, and yet the canons needed them, the town needed them, the merchant needed them, the dying needed them, and when they withheld their labour, the entire acoustic world of the community went silent. That is a kind of power that titles cannot manufacture and wealth cannot easily replace. It is the power of being genuinely irreplaceably necessary. Let me tell you about one more dimension of the bell ringers' world that I think deserves to be remembered. The physical space they inhabited. The bell tower was not a comfortable place to work. In summer, the heat collected in the upper chamber and made the air thick and still. In winter, the wind found every crack in the stone and the temperature could drop well below freezing. The ropes were rough and heavy. The floors of the belfry were coated in decades of accumulated dust and droppings from the birds that nested in the louvered openings, and the noise. When multiple large bells rang simultaneously in an enclosed stone space, the sound was not simply loud. It was physically overwhelming. Medieval bell ringers working over years and decades at their craft frequently suffered significant hearing loss. This was simply understood as part of the occupation and expected cost absorbed without complaint, because the alternative was not ringing the bells. And not ringing the bells was not an option. There is one final thing I want to say about the sextons and bell ringers of the medieval world before we move on. Something that I think speaks to something enduring and recognizable about human nature. Many of them loved it, not just as a job, not just as a source of income. They loved the bells. There are accounts scattered through parish records, through the occasional memoir, through the observations of visiting travellers and scholars of bell ringers who spent their entire working lives in service to the same bells. Who knew each bell by its voice? Who could distinguish from the sound alone when a bell was slightly out of tune, or when the clapper was wearing in a way that would eventually need attention? Who felt in the ringing of a great peal on a feast day something that went beyond physical labour into something closer to joy? The bells had names, and the people who rang them year after year, decade after decade, they knew those names. They knew the character of each bell, its weight and its swing and its particular voice in the cold morning air. And I think the relationship between a craftsman and the instrument of their craft, developed over a lifetime of daily contact, is one of the most recognizable things in this entire story. It does not matter what century you live in. The feeling of knowing your work so deeply that it becomes part of who you are, that is not historical. That is human. We've now met the people behind the bells, the sextons with their early mornings and their legal accountability, the guild ringers with their organised skill and their quiet but real power, the unnamed men and women who climbed cold stone stairs in darkness to perform every day an act that the whole town depended upon. But there is a dimension of medieval bell culture that we have not yet entered, and it is perhaps the most surprising of all, because everything we have discussed so far has been about what bells did for the community. What we have not yet explored is what bells did to the community. What happened when the bells stopped? Not because the ringer was ill or the rope broke or the tower was struck by lightning, but because someone with authority decided they should stop, deliberately, completely, as a punishment. Because in the medieval world, silence was not just an absence of sound. Silence was a weapon. And the story of how that weapon was used, who wielded it against whom, and what it felt like to live in a town where the bells had been taken away, is one of the most extraordinary chapters in this entire history. And it begins right now. Silence in the medieval world was never neutral. It was never simply the absence of sound the way we might experience it today, a quiet morning, a peaceful room, a moment of rest between one noise and the next. In a world organised entirely around sound, silence was loaded. It meant something. And when that silence was imposed deliberately, when the bells were stilled by an act of will rather than an accident of nature, it sent a message that every person within earshot understood with the clarity of a shout. You have been cut off. To understand what that meant, you have to understand something about the medieval Catholic Church that goes beyond theology and into the realm of pure political architecture. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Church was not simply a religious institution. It was the organising framework of European civilization. It ran the hospitals. It educated the children. It maintained the only reliable network of written records across the continent. It provided the only system of law that crossed political borders. It performed every major ritual of human life, birth, marriage, death. And without its participation, those rituals had no legal or social standing. Kings needed the Church's blessing to rule legitimately. Merchants needed its moral framework to conduct trade with any expectation of trust. Ordinary people needed its sacraments not just for spiritual comfort, but for their basic identity as members of a community. And the Pope, as the head of this institution, held a power that had no precise equivalent in the modern world. He could not command armies directly or not always. He could not levy taxes across borders or not consistently. But he could do something that no king or emperor could do. He could reach inside every community in Europe and silence its bells. That power had a name, the interdict. An interdict was a formal ecclesiastical censure, a punishment imposed not on an individual but on an entire territory. When a pope placed an interdict on a kingdom or a region, the effect was immediate and total. All public celebration of the sacraments ceased. No mass was sung. No marriages were blessed by the church. No last rites were administered. The dead could not receive a Christian burial. And the bells, those bells that had organized every moment of daily life, that had told people when to wake and when to sleep, when to buy and when to mourn, that had been the acoustic heartbeat of the community for generations, went silent. All of them, all at once, across an entire country. The most dramatic example of this in English history occurred in the year 1208. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes in medieval history, a man who understood the political use of ecclesiastical power with extraordinary sophistication, placed all of England under interdict. The reason was a dispute with King John over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. John had refused to accept the Pope's chosen candidate, Stephen Langton. The Pope had warned him. John had continued to refuse, and so in March of 1208 the interdict fell. Not on John personally, not on his court, not on his soldiers, on England, all of it. Every parish, every cathedral, every village church with its single small bell hanging in a timber frame, silent. I want you to try to imagine what that actually felt like. You are a wool merchant in the city of Lincoln. You wake on the morning after the interdict begins. The bell does not ring. Not the prime bell that has woken you every morning since childhood. Not the market bell that tells you when trading can begin. Not the Angelus bell at noon. Nothing. The tower of the parish church you pass every day on your way to the market stands above the rooftops exactly as it always has. The bells are still there. You can see the outline of them through the louvered openings, but they do not speak. And in that silence, something that you have never consciously thought about, because it was always simply there, always simply part of the air you breathed, becomes suddenly achingly visible by its absence. The acoustic architecture of your world has collapsed. Contemporary accounts from the period of the English interdict, which lasted 6 full years, from 1208 to 1214, describe the psychological effect on ordinary people with a consistency that is striking. Disorientation, grief, a pervasive sense that something fundamental had been broken. One monastic chronicle describes the silence of the bells as feeling like the death of the community itself. Another account from a chronicler writing in the years immediately following the interdict's lifting notes that when the bells finally rang again, when Pope Innocent and King John reached their agreement and the interdict was lifted, people wept in the streets, not just with religious relief, with something more immediate and more visceral. They wept. The way you weep when something you love, something so constant and so present that you stopped noticing it years ago, is suddenly returned to you after years of absence. The bells came back, and the world that the bells had always organized, the world that had continued to turn during those 6 silent years, but had done so without its heartbeat, suddenly felt whole again. Now here is what I think is the most politically sophisticated aspect of the interdict as a tool of power. And I want to be honest that this is partly my own interpretation, though I think it is grounded in what the historical record shows. The Pope did not impose the interdict to punish King John, not directly. John was perfectly comfortable in his palace eating well, conducting his affairs largely insulated from the daily disruption that the interdict caused, the Pope imposed the interdict to punish John's subjects, to make the wool merchant in Lincoln and the baker in Canterbury and the farmer in Somerset feel in their daily lives the consequences of their king's stubbornness, to make them pressure John, to make them angry at him, to make them understand that the dispute between their king and the Pope in Rome was not some abstract theological argument happening somewhere far away. It was the reason the bells were silent. It was the reason their dead were being buried without ceremony. It was the reason their marriages had no sacred standing. The silence of the bells was a political message, addressed not to the powerful but to the powerless, delivered not in words but in sound, or rather in its absence, and I find myself sitting with the ethics of that for a moment, because there is something genuinely uncomfortable about it. The people of England in 1208 had no vote. They had no mechanism to pressure their king through any institutional channel. They could not petition or protest or organise politically in any way that the medieval system recognised. And yet the Pope's interdict placed on their shoulders the burden of resolving a dispute that was not of their making. Their daily lives, their spiritual comfort, their community rituals, the acoustic pulse of their towns were used as leverage in a power struggle between two men who both claimed authority over them. That is worth sitting with. Not to condemn the medieval church, which was operating according to its own internal logic in ways that made sense within its world, but to notice that the use of ordinary people's daily lives as leverage in power struggles is not a medieval invention. It has continued in different forms in every century since, but the papal interdict was not the only way that bells could be weaponized through silence. At the local level, individual bishops and even parish priests had their own smaller version of this power. The excommunication of an individual, the formal exclusion of a single person from the church and its sacraments, carried with it in many communities a bell-related ritual that was as public as it was humiliating. The ceremony of excommunication, as it was practiced in the medieval church, involved 3 actions. The book was closed, signifying the closing of the scriptures to the individual. The candle was extinguished, signifying the removal of the light of faith. And the bell was tolled, but not in the way of the passing bell, which was slow and compassionate and communal. The excommunication bell was deliberately different. In some traditions it was rung in a broken irregular pattern, a kind of unringing, a sound that communicated disruption rather than ceremony. In others it was simply the fact of the tolling itself, combined with the public announcement of the person's name, that transformed the bell from a voice of community into a voice of exclusion. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew what it meant. And from that moment forward, the person whose name had been announced was in the acoustic world of the medieval community as good as absent. The bells would still ring their daily patterns, the market bell, the canonical hours, the passing bell for the dying. But they no longer rang for this person, because this person in the eyes of the church and the community that the church organised was no longer fully there. There is a question I keep returning to as I explore this dimension of the story, and I genuinely do not know the answer, which is part of why I find it so interesting. Is it worse to be surrounded by sound and excluded from it, or to live in silence alongside everyone else? The person under individual excommunication still heard the bells every day, still woke to the prime bell, still felt the market bell in their chest, still heard the passing bell toll for their neighbours, but the bells were no longer speaking to them, no longer including them, no longer weaving them into the fabric of the community they still physically inhabited. That strikes me as a particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness not of absence but of adjacency, being right there, in the same street under the same sky, hearing the same sounds, and yet on the other side of an invisible wall that the sound of a bell had built around you. Now the flip side of all this, and it is an important flip side, is what happened when the bells came back. Because just as silence was a punishment, sound was a restoration. When an excommunicated person was received back into the community, when they had made whatever penance or payment or submission was required, the ceremony of reconciliation also involved bells. The same bell that had announced the exclusion was rung again, but now in the familiar, steady, welcoming pattern of normal community ringing. A sound that said you are here again, you belong again. The community receives you back. And when a papal interdict was lifted from an entire territory, as happened in England in 1214, after years of silence, the ringing of the bells on that first free day was described in contemporary accounts as something close to overwhelming, a release, a collective exhale. The chronicler Roger of Wendover, writing about the lifting of the English interdict, describes the scene at a cathedral in terms that suggest something beyond ordinary religious ceremony. The bells rang, and people stood in the streets and listened, not moving, not speaking, just listening to the sound that told them they were whole again. I have been thinking as I put this part of the story together about what all of this says about the relationship between sound and belonging. We tend to think of belonging as something internal, a feeling, a sense of connection. But the medieval experience of bells suggests something more external than that, more physical, more immediate. For the people of a medieval town, belonging was partly acoustic. You belonged to your community because you heard its bells, because those bells spoke to you, woke you, guided you, warned you, mourned with you, because you were inside the sound. And when the bell stopped, whether through interdict or excommunication, or the more personal devastation of a sexton who fell ill and left no replacement, you felt the loss of belonging not as an idea but as a sensation, a physical absence, a gap in the air where something had always been. That is a way of experiencing community that most of us in a world of individual earbuds and private playlists have almost entirely lost access to. And I wonder sometimes whether we know what we are missing. Now, silence as a weapon was used in both directions. The church used it against kings and communities. But there were also moments when communities pushed back, when the people, not the Pope, not the Bishop, not the Lord, decided that a bell was going to ring whether the authorities approved or not. And those stories of bells rung in defiance of communities reclaiming their acoustic world against the wishes of power are some of the most quietly remarkable stories in all of medieval history. But before we get there, there is one more dimension of the bell's power that we have not yet entered. A dimension that is stranger, more intimate, and in some ways more revealing than anything we have discussed so far. Because we have talked about what bells did for the community in moments of crisis and ceremony and commerce and death, but we have not yet talked about what bells did in the quiet spaces between all of those things, what they did in the imagination, in the body, in the superstitions and the folk beliefs and the half-remembered magical thinking that ran underneath the official theology like a river beneath stone. Because medieval people did not just hear bells as announcements or signals or legal authority, they believed bells could heal, could protect, could speak directly to forces that existed beyond the boundaries of the visible world. And some of what they believed is going to surprise you considerably. That story's coming up right now. Something shifts when we step into this part of the story. Up until now, we have been moving through the official world of medieval bells, the sanctioned, documented, institutionally approved world, the canonical hours, the market regulations, the papal interdict, the bell ringers' wages recorded in parish accounts, all of it real, all of it verifiable, all of it sitting neatly in the historical record where scholars can find it and examine it and write papers about it. But underneath that official world woven into the daily fabric of medieval life in ways that the church sometimes approved of, sometimes tolerated and sometimes tried very hard to stamp out, was another relationship with bells entirely. One that lived not in the legal codes or the ecclesiastical registers, but in the bodies of ordinary people, in their fears, in their hopes, in the things they whispered to each other when the priest was not listening. Let us start with something that the church itself endorsed, because I think it establishes the foundation for everything stranger that follows. In the official theology of the medieval Catholic Church, a consecrated bell possessed genuine spiritual power. Not symbolic spiritual power, not metaphorical spiritual power, real operative effective power to influence the physical and spiritual world. This was not folk belief sneaking in through the back door. This was doctrine. The ceremony of baptizing a bell, which we explored earlier in this story, was not merely ceremonial. It was understood to genuinely transform the object. Before consecration, a bell was metal. After consecration, it was something more. It was in the medieval theological understanding an instrument through which divine protection could be channeled into the acoustic world of the community, and the most significant expression of that protection was the belief held by theologians written into official church documents, referenced in sermons preached from pulpits across Europe, that the sound of a consecrated bell could drive away evil, specifically that it could drive away storms. This belief had a name. It was called the Baptisma Campanae, the baptism of bells in action, and it was practiced across Catholic Europe from at least the 9th century onward. When a storm approached a medieval town, the kind of violent, fast-moving thunderstorm that could flatten a crop in an hour or start a fire with a single lightning strike, the church bells were rung, not in the steady, deliberate rhythm of the canonical hours, not in the slow toll of the passing bell, in a sustained, urgent peal, continuous ringing meant to fill the air with consecrated sound, to create what the medieval imagination conceived of as an acoustic barrier between the community and the forces of the storm. The theological reasoning went something like this. Storms in the medieval worldview were not purely natural phenomena. They were understood to have a demonic dimension. Not that every storm was literally caused by a demon, but that the destructive forces of nature and the destructive forces of evil were connected in ways that consecrated things could address. The blessed sound of the bell purified the air through which it travelled. It disrupted whatever demonic influence might be amplifying or directing the storm. It called God's attention to the community in danger, and therefore it protected. Now here is what I find genuinely remarkable about this practice. It was taken seriously by people who were, by the standards of their time, highly educated. We're not talking about isolated, illiterate peasants clinging to pre-Christian superstition. We're talking about bishops, about cathedral chapters, about the authors of theological texts that were studied in the universities of Paris and Oxford and Bologna. These were people who could debate the fine points of Aristotelian philosophy and still in the same week order the bells rung when a storm was approaching because they genuinely believed it would help. I find that fascinating rather than puzzling, because I think it tells us something important about how human beings actually hold belief, not in neat, consistent, philosophically watertight systems, but in the complicated, layered, sometimes contradictory way that real experience demands. The medieval theologian who believed that bell sound could drive away storms was not being inconsistent. He was being human. He was holding his learned theology alongside his embodied experience of living in a world where storms were real and terrifying, and the sound of the bells had on at least some occasions seemed to coincide with the storm passing. We all do this. We're all more superstitious than we admit. The details are just different, but the storm bell was only the beginning of what medieval people believed bells could do, and this is where the story moves from the officially sanctioned into something considerably more personal. Because while the church approved of ringing bells during storms, there were other uses of bell power that existed in a greyer area. Practices that the church knew about occasionally tried to discourage, but ultimately could not eradicate because they were too deeply woven into the fabric of daily belief. One of the most widespread of these was the belief that bell sound could protect against plague. The Black Death, which swept through Europe beginning in 1348 and returned in waves throughout the second half of the 14th century, killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population depending on the region. In the face of something that catastrophic, in the face of a disease that killed seemingly at random, that no medical knowledge could explain or treat, that spared some people and destroyed entire families of others, human beings reached for every possible source of protection. And they reached for bells. In many towns during plague outbreaks, bells were rung continuously throughout the day, not for any specific person, not for any specific ceremony, but as a kind of constant acoustic prayer. A sustained appeal to whatever forces of protection existed. A statement to the air itself: we are here, we are consecrated, we are protected. Contemporary accounts from plague-affected cities in England and France and Italy describe bell ringing that went on for hours, sometimes for days. And here is the detail that stops me every time I encounter it. In some cities, the bells rang so continuously during plague outbreaks that civic authorities eventually had to order them to stop. Not because they thought the ringing was ineffective, but because the sound of constant bell ringing was making people more frightened, not less. The very sound that was meant to protect them had become, through its uninterrupted urgency, a reminder of how desperate the situation was. A reminder that there were so many dying, so much fear in the air, that the bells could not even pause. So the authorities made a decision that required real courage. They silenced the bells, not as punishment, not as exclusion, as mercy, to give people a few hours of acoustic peace, a few hours in which the air did not vibrate with the sound of emergency. The silence in that context was itself a form of care. Let me tell you now about a belief that I find both strange and deeply moving. It involves childbirth. In the medieval world, childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could undergo. Mortality rates for mothers and infants were high by any measure. The pain was intense and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. And in the face of that uncertainty, women and their families reached for every form of help they could access. They brought relics into the birthing room. They called for prayers. They used every remedy that midwives and healers had accumulated over generations, and many of them paid to have the bells rung. The belief documented in parish records across England, France and Germany was that the sound of a consecrated bell ringing during a difficult labour could ease the pain and hasten a safe delivery. The theological framing was that the sacred sound could draw the attention and protection of the Virgin Mary, who was believed to be a particular intercessor for women in childbirth. The practical reality was that a woman lying in pain and fear, hearing the deep, steady sound of a bell in a nearby tower, may have experienced something genuinely calming, something that regulated her breathing, something that gave her a rhythm to focus on beyond the rhythm of pain. We understand now in ways that medieval people could not have articulated how profoundly sound affects the nervous system, how certain rhythms and frequencies can lower heart rate and reduce the perception of pain. The medieval women who paid for the birthing bell were operating from a theological framework that modern science would not recognize. But the underlying instinct that the right sound at the right moment in the right space can help a human body through its most difficult passages, that instinct was not wrong. Now here is the part of the story where things get genuinely strange. And I say that with complete affection because the strangeness is also a form of beauty. There was a practice documented in medieval records from England and France in which women who could not afford to pay for the bells to be rung during their labour found another way to access the power they believed those bells contained. They brought something to the church before the birth. Specifically, they brought their girdle, the cloth belt or cord that they wore around their waist, and they wrapped that girdle around the body of a church bell, not to ring it, not to cause any sound, simply to let the cloth rest against the consecrated metal, to let whatever sacred quality the bell possessed transfer itself through contact into the cloth, and then they took that girdle home and wore it during labour as an amulet, as a portable version of the bell's protection, a piece of cloth that had touched the sacred thing carried now against the body of a woman in the most vulnerable hours of her life. I want to just sit with that image for a moment, because I think there is something in it that transcends the specific medieval context. A woman who cannot afford what she needs, who has no access to the official channels through which protection is supposed to flow, who improvises, who finds a way to bring the sacred thing into contact with her own life in whatever form she can manage. That is not superstition. That is resourcefulness. That is love, a family's love for a woman's love for the child she's about to bring into the world, making do, finding a way with whatever is available. That impulse does not belong to the Middle Ages. It belongs to every human being who has ever stood at the edge of something frightening and reached for anything that might help. The magical thinking around bells extended in other directions too. There was a widespread belief that bell sound could protect crops. In agricultural communities across France and England, the spring bell rung at specific moments, in the agricultural calendar often tied to feast days that marked the turning of the season, was believed to bless the fields within earshot. Farmers paid attention to which fields lay within the sound of the parish bell. Fields that could not hear the bell were considered slightly less protected, slightly more vulnerable to the vagaries of weather and pestilence, and the invisible forces that seemed without warning to blight a crop between one week and the next. In some communities, the boundaries of the parish were literally defined by the reach of the bell's sound. You were inside the community if you could hear the bell. You were outside it if you could not. Not the administrative boundary, not the line on a document, the boundary drawn in sound. The edge of hearing was the edge of belonging. There is one more belief I want to tell you about because it connects to something we've already explored earlier in this story, and adds a dimension to it that I did not fully appreciate until I started looking at the folk traditions more carefully. We talked about the death knell the bell rung to announce a passing counted out in strokes for each year of a life, and we talked about the official theologically sanctioned belief that the bell sound drove away evil forces at the moment of death, protecting the departing soul. But in the popular belief that ran underneath that official theology, the power of the death bell was understood in even more immediate, more physical terms. It was believed that the sound of the death knell heard by a person who was themselves ill could actually speed their recovery. The reasoning was something like this. The bell's sound at the moment of death was especially powerful, charged in a sense by the spiritual intensity of the crossing that was happening. And that charged sound spreading outward through the air of the town carried healing energy with it. If you were sick when the death bell rang, and you heard it, and you prayed in that moment, you might be helped by the same force that was helping the departing soul on its journey. Death and healing in the medieval imagination were not opposites. They were connected. Both moments of crossing, both moments when the invisible world pressed close against the visible one, and the bell at both crossings was the sound that marked the threshold. I've been thinking as I put this part of the story together about how easy it is to look at these beliefs from a distance and feel superior to them, to think how charming, how credulous, how little they understood about the way the world actually works. And then I think about the things that we do, the rituals we perform before important moments, the objects we keep because they feel lucky, the music we put on when we need comfort or courage or a sense that the universe is on our side, the playlist you listen to before a difficult conversation, the shirt you wear on the day of an important interview, the song that for reasons you cannot entirely explain makes you feel like everything is going to be all right. These are not so different. The medieval woman wrapping her girdle around a church bell was doing what human beings have always done, reaching toward whatever source of meaning and protection her world made available, making the sacred tangible, making the unseen heard. We just call our version of it something different. Now, all of the beliefs we've explored in this part of the story, the storm bell, the plague bell, the birth bell, the healing power of the death knell, share a common thread. They all place the bell at the boundary between the known world and the unknown one, between the safe and the dangerous, between the living and the dying, between the controllable and the utterly beyond human reach. The bell in the medieval imagination was not just a timekeeping device. It was not just a signal or an alarm or a legal authority. It was a guardian, a voice that stood at every threshold and said, whatever is on the other side of this moment, you are not facing it alone. And perhaps that is the most human thing about the medieval world's relationship with bells. Not the theology, not the commerce, not the legal codes, but that impulse. The need to mark the frightening moments with sound, to make the crossing audible, to feel in the ringing that the community was present with you even in the moments when you were most alone. We have now moved through the magical and the mystical and the deeply intimate dimensions of what bells meant to medieval people. But there is one final thread in this story that we have not yet picked up, and it may be the most unexpected one of all, because everything we have discussed has been about what bells meant to the people who lived inside their sound. We have not yet talked about what happens when the technology changes, when the mechanical clock arrives, when the bell's monopoly on time is broken, when the thing that everyone depended upon, that organized every market, every prayer, every harvest, every death, suddenly has a competitor. And the competition between bells and clocks in the later medieval period is not the simple story of progress replacing tradition that most people assume it is. It is something considerably more complicated and considerably more human, because the people of the 14th and 15th centuries did not simply trade one timekeeping system for another. They argued about it, they resisted it, they sometimes broke the new clocks, and they clung to their bells with a passion that, once you understand what those bells had meant to them, makes complete and perfect sense. That story is coming up next. Here is a question worth sitting with before we begin this part of the story. When was the last time a new technology arrived in your life and you genuinely thought, not just as a passing grumble, that something important was being lost? Maybe it was when streaming replaced physical music, when GPS replaced the habit of reading a map and actually knowing where you were, when texting replaced phone calls and phone calls had already replaced letters. We tend to narrate these changes as pure progress, newer, faster, more efficient. The old way dissolves and the new way takes over and life continues. But the people living through those transitions often experience something more complicated than progress. They experience loss alongside gain, disorientation alongside convenience, and sometimes more often than the history books acknowledge genuine resistance. The arrival of the mechanical clock in medieval Europe was exactly that kind of transition, and the story of how ordinary people, merchants, clergy, and civic leaders responded to it is one of the most quietly dramatic technological conflicts of the entire medieval period. Let us set the scene precisely. The first mechanical clock's weight-driven devices, using a mechanism called the Virgin Foliot Escapement, began appearing in European towers in the final decades of the 13th century. The earliest documented examples that historians can reliably date include a clock installed at Dunstable Priory in England in 1283, and another at Canterbury Cathedral around the same period. These early devices were not the elegant face-displaying clocks we imagine when we hear the word. They had no hands, no face, no dial. They were in their earliest form purely striking machines, mechanisms designed to ring a bell at regular intervals, automatically, without a human being deciding when to pull the rope. In other words, the first mechanical clocks were not replacements for bells, they were bell-ringing machines, which tells you something important about what problem the inventors were actually trying to solve. The problem was consistency. One of the persistent challenges of the sexton-based timekeeping system, as good as the best sextons were, and many of them were very good indeed, was variability. A sexton who was ill rang the bells late. A sexton who was distracted by a difficult morning rang them slightly early. A sexton who was new to the position was still calibrating his sense of the canonical hours against the reality of the sky. Over weeks and months, a pattern of small errors accumulated. The prime bell might drift 5 minutes later than it should be. The Vespers bell might ring 10 minutes early. For most purposes, this did not matter much, but for commerce, for the merchants who were building increasingly complex trade networks across cities and across borders, who needed to coordinate with partners in other towns, who were developing contracts and financial instruments that depended on shared, reliable, consistent time, 5 minutes mattered. 10 minutes could mean the difference between a deal honoured and a deal disputed. The mechanical clock promised something the sexton could not reliably provide. The same hour every day regardless of who was pulling the rope. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because the introduction of mechanical clocks did not sweep away the bell-based system quickly or cleanly. It did not sweep it away at all for a very long time. What it did instead was create a tension, a long, complicated, sometimes contentious tension, between two systems of time that coexisted in the same town, often in the same building, sometimes literally within earshot of each other. And the people caught in the middle of that tension were not passive observers. They had opinions, strong ones. Let me tell you about a conflict that I think illustrates this perfectly. In the city of Aire-sur-la-Lie in northern France, a prosperous cloth-trading town with strong guild culture, a dispute broke out in the early 14th century over the ringing of the workers' bell. The workers' bell in Aire-sur-la-Lie was a bell specifically dedicated to marking the hours of the working day for labourers in the cloth industry. It told them when to begin work, when to take their midday break, when to stop in the evening. Their wages were calculated by the hours the bell marked. When the town's merchants and employers began consulting the new mechanical clock, rather than the traditional bell to determine working hours, the workers objected, strenuously, because the mechanical clock, which divided the day into fixed equal hours regardless of season, produced a different set of hours than the traditional system of canonical time, which, as we discussed earlier, breathed with the seasons. In summer, under the old bell system, the working hours were longer because the day itself was longer. Under the new mechanical system, hours were equal year-round. For workers in summer, this meant fewer paid hours than they had previously received. The dispute went on for years. It involved the civic authorities, the guild leadership, and at one point escalated to the point where there were accusations of manipulation, that the merchants were deliberately consulting the mechanical clock in summer, when its fixed hours were shorter than the canonical hours, and reverting to the canonical bell in winter when the opposite was true. In other words, the employers were accused of choosing whichever timekeeping system gave them the cheaper labour bill, which, if true, was not a uniquely medieval form of dishonesty. That conflict in Aire-sur-la-Lie is documented in records that scholars of medieval labour history have studied carefully. And what strikes me most about it is not the specific dispute over wages. It is the fact that two timekeeping systems existing simultaneously in the same town created conditions under which time itself became contested, where the question of what hour it was, a question that had always been settled definitively by a single bell, now had multiple possible answers, depending on which system you consulted and who was doing the consulting. Time had become political. Not because of anything inherently problematic about mechanical clocks, but because the transition between systems was slow enough, and the stakes were high enough that both systems remained in use simultaneously for long enough to create genuine conflict. The historian Jacques Le Goff, in his landmark study of time and labour in medieval Europe, made an argument that I find genuinely compelling. He suggested that the spread of mechanical clock time represented a fundamental shift in how European societies understood the relationship between time and work. Under the old system, the system of canonical hours and bells time was fundamentally sacred. It was organized around the rhythm of prayer and liturgy. It breathed with the seasons. It belonged in a philosophical sense to God. Under the new system of mechanical clock time, time became secular. It was equal, fixed, measurable, tradable. An hour in December was the same as an hour in June. An hour of prayer time was the same as an hour of work time. Time, in other words, became a commodity, something that could be bought and sold, something whose value could be negotiated, something that belonged not to God or to the community, but to whoever was doing the measuring. Le Goff argued that this shift from sacred time to merchant time was one of the quiet engines driving the transformation of medieval Europe into early modern Europe. Not the only engine, not the primary one, but a real one. And the moment of that shift, he suggested, can be located precisely in the period when mechanical clocks began competing with bells for the authority to say, "This is what time it is." Now I want to be honest about something. Le Goff's thesis is influential but also contested. Other historians have argued that the picture is more complicated, that merchants had been developing their own pragmatic approaches to time long before mechanical clocks arrived, and that the bells themselves had already been serving commercial purposes for centuries. Which is true, as we have seen throughout this story. The market bell, the guild bell, the working day bell, these were already secular instruments operating within a sacred framework. But I think the core of Le Goff's observation still holds, because the mechanical clock did something that the bell, for all its power, could never quite do. It made time visible. That last point deserves a moment. The bell made time audible. That was its genius. You did not need to be literate. You did not need to own anything. You did not need to be anywhere specific. You just needed to be within earshot. And that universality, that radical accessibility of sound, was what made the bell-based system so durable, so powerful, and so deeply embedded in community life. But audible time has a limitation. It disappears the moment it is spoken. The bell rings, and then the sound is gone. And if you missed it, if you were in a basement workshop or a noisy smithy or simply wool gathering for a moment when the bell rang, you had no way of knowing what time it was until the next bell. The mechanical clock face, once it developed in the mid-14th century, offered something different. Time that persisted. Time you could consult at any moment, not just when the bell chose to speak. Time that was visible in the silent intervals between sounds. And here is where the human response to this new technology gets genuinely interesting. Because you might expect that the arrival of something so useful, time that you could see, as well as hear, would be welcomed everywhere immediately. It was not. In many communities, the response to the mechanical clock was deeply ambivalent, and in some cases it was actively hostile. There are documented instances from the 14th and 15th centuries of civic authorities ordering newly installed clocks to be synchronized not to their own mechanical rhythm, but to the local bells. In other words, the clock is fine, but it must agree with the bell, not the other way around. The bell remained in the civic imagination of these communities the authoritative source of time. The clock was useful as a supplementary instrument, a way of subdividing the hours that the bell marked, a way of consulting time in the quiet intervals between bell strokes. But the clock did not get to define the hour. That authority still belonged to the bell. There is a story from this period that I find almost too perfect to be true, and yet it is documented. When the great clock of Rouen Cathedral in France, one of the most sophisticated mechanical timepieces of its era, was installed and began to sound its strikes, it created an immediate problem. The clock strikes did not always align precisely with the existing bell schedule that the cathedral community had maintained for generations. Small discrepancies, a few minutes here and there, but in a community where the entire rhythm of daily life, the prayers, the meals, the working hours had been organized around specific bell patterns for longer than anyone could remember, even small discrepancies were felt. They felt wrong. Not just inaccurate, wrong in the deeper sense, the sense of something being out of harmony with what the community had always known to be true. And the cathedral chapter, after some deliberation, made a decision that says everything about the psychology of this transition. They adjusted the clock to match the bells, not the bells to match the clock. The bells won. I want to pause here and ask you something that I think is genuinely worth considering. Have you ever been in a situation where a new objectively more accurate or efficient system arrived and the people around you refused to adopt it? Where the resistance was not really about the new system's quality, but about something harder to name, about identity, about the feeling that changing this particular thing meant changing something fundamental about who you were and how your community worked. Because I think that is what was happening in many of these communities. The bell was not just a timekeeping device. As we have seen across this entire story, the bell was woven into the deepest layers of communal life. It was present at birth and death, at commerce and prayer, at crisis and celebration. To say that the clock would now tell time and not the bell was not a simple technological substitution. It was a question about authority, about memory, about which voice the community chose to listen to. And for a long time in many places the answer was clear. We listen to the bell, the clock may speak, but the bell has the final word. The transition happened gradually over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries and into the 16th. Different towns moved at different speeds, different communities made different accommodations. In some places the mechanical clock and the bells merged into a single system. The clock striking the hours automatically driving the bells to ring as they always had, but now with mechanical regularity rather than human judgment. This was in many ways the most elegant solution. The clock provided the consistency that the sexton had always struggled to maintain. The bells provided the reach and the resonance that the clock face alone could never achieve. The community got both. The sound they had always known. The reliability they had increasingly needed. In other places the shift was more disruptive. Bells that had rung for canonical hours began to fall silent as the liturgical schedule was simplified. Working day bells that had regulated labour for centuries were replaced by clock-based systems that calculated time in fixed equal units. And with each such change, something of the old acoustic world diminished a little. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, steadily, one community at a time. There is a detail from this period that I think is worth preserving. As mechanical clocks spread, and the canonical hour system began to give way to the equal hour system of clock time, something happened to language. New words appeared. Words we still use today. The word o'clock, as in 3 o'clock, is a contraction of the clock. It emerged in the 15th century specifically to distinguish the new clock-based hours from the old canonical hours. 3 of the clock meant 3 hours as measured by the mechanical clock, not 3 according to the canonical system, not 3 according to the sexton's reading of the sky. 3 of this clock. That little phrase was in its moment a technological declaration, a statement that a new authority had arrived to tell time, and we still use it today, a clock, without ever thinking about the moment of transition it was born in. The moment when the mechanical clock was new enough that people felt they needed to specify which system of time they meant, the bell system or the clocks. But here is what I think is the most important thing to carry away from this part of the story. The mechanical clock did not make bells obsolete. Not in the 14th century, not in the 15th, not in the 16th, not in fact ever. The bells kept ringing. They incorporated the mechanical clock into their operations, synchronized their strokes with its gears, and continued to be the primary way that most ordinary people experienced time as sound, as community, as something shared in the air between them. Because a clock face can tell one person the time, a bell can tell an entire city. And that difference, the difference between private and public, time between individual knowledge and shared knowledge between the world of the screen and the world of the sound, is a difference that turns out to matter enormously, in ways that this story's about to make very clear. Because the final chapters of the medieval bell's history bring us somewhere unexpected, not into the past, into the present, into the words you use every day, the habits you follow without knowing why, the rhythms of your own life that were shaped centuries ago by the sound of bells you've never heard. That is where we are going next. Words are strange things. We use them every day without thinking about where they came from, without knowing the history packed inside them like sediment layer upon layer of meaning that accumulated over centuries before they reached us in the particular shape we recognize. And sometimes when you stop and actually look at the words you use most casually, you find that they are carrying stories you never knew were there. Stories that reach back to a world so different from ours that it might as well be a foreign country. Stories about bells. Let me start with one you almost certainly used this week. Curfew. We talked about the practice itself, the evening bell, the covering of fires, the locked gates. But I want to stay with the word itself for a moment because I think the fact that it survived is remarkable. Couvre-feu. Cover fire. That phrase crossed the English Channel with the Norman conquest in 1066. It embedded itself in the English language. It survived the collapse of Norman French as a spoken language in England. It survived the Reformation, which dismantled much of the bell-based religious culture that gave it meaning. It survived the Industrial Revolution, which replaced fire as the primary domestic heat source. It survived the invention of electricity, which rendered the original danger almost entirely moot. And here it is today, still in use. Still meaning roughly the same thing it has always meant, a designated time after which you're supposed to be indoors off the streets contained. Your parents told you about your curfew. City administrators impose curfews during emergencies. News anchors talk about curfews when cities are in crisis. And every single time that word is used, it carries inside it the ghost of a medieval evening bell ringing over timber houses in a Norman town, telling everyone to cover their fires before the darkness and the sparks could conspire to burn the whole thing down. You're speaking medieval French every time you say it, and you almost certainly did not know. Here is another one. Noon. We touched on this earlier in the story, the way that the canonical hour of none, which was originally the 9th hour of the day, and fell in mid-afternoon, gradually migrated earlier and earlier, until it fused with midday. But I want to sit with the full strangeness of this for a moment. The word noon literally means 9. It comes from the Latin nona hora, the 9th hour. And yet noon today means 12. Not 9. 12. How does a word that means 9 come to mean 12 through bells? Through the slow drift of a monastic schedule over the course of several centuries, as the monks who were supposed to ring the nun bell at 3 in the afternoon began ringing it earlier and earlier at 2, then at 1, then finally at the midday mark, and the word simply followed the sound. The bell moved, the word moved with it, and now we are left with a word that is, if you look at it honestly, a small fossilized error, a miscalculation by medieval monks that became so universal, so deeply embedded in so many languages across Europe, that it is now simply the word for midday. Noon, the 9th hour, which is the 12th hour, because a bell rang at the wrong time for long enough that everyone stopped noticing. Let me ask you something. How many words do you think are hiding stories like this? How many of the ordinary unremarkable words you use every single day are carrying medieval sound inside them? The echo of a bell that rang 800 years ago, in a language you do not speak in a town whose name you have never heard for a reason that has long since evaporated from daily life more than you would guess. Far more, take the word campanology. That is the formal name for the study of bells, and bell ringing a word that most people have never heard and would never need in ordinary conversation, but look at its root. Campana, the Latin word for bell, which itself came from the region of Campania in southern Italy, where some of the finest bell-casting work of the early medieval period was done. That regional association, bells from Campania, became so strong that the word for the region became the word for the thing. Campana, bell. And from that root came campanile, the Italian word for a freestanding bell tower, the kind you see in Italian cities, most famously in Pisa. Campanology, campanile, and less obviously champion, which does not come from the same root but has spent centuries sharing sonic space with these words in ways that make the connections feel real even when they are not. Language is not always logical, but it is always human. Now let me take you somewhere more unexpected. Because the linguistic legacy of medieval bells is not limited to the words that obviously reference bells. It reaches into idioms, into expressions, into ways of thinking about the world that we've inherited without knowing where they came from. Consider the phrase "saved by the bell." Today we use it to describe being rescued from a difficult situation at the last possible moment. Your boss asks for the report you've not finished. The fire alarm goes off, saved by the bell. The most common explanation for this phrase connects it to boxing the bell that ends around saving a fighter from further punishment, and that is probably the most direct origin of the specific modern expression. But the imagery draws on something much older. In medieval towns, as we have seen, the bell was literally the mechanism by which many legal deadlines were set and enforced. A contract had to be completed before the market bell. A hearing had to conclude before the vespers bell. A curfew violation was only a violation if you were caught after the curfew bell. The bell marked the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate, between guilty and not guilty, between the moment when something was required and the moment when it no longer was. Being on the right side of the bell's sound, being finished, being indoors, being compliant, before that particular stroke was in the most literal possible sense being saved by it. The boxing ring borrowed an image that was already ancient, already woven into the intuitions of anyone who had grown up in a world organized by bells. There is another phrase I want to tell you about, one that is so common in English that you have almost certainly used it without thinking twice. That rings a bell, meaning that sounds familiar. That connects to something I know. That produces a recognition in me. Now on the surface, this is just a metaphor, a pleasant, slightly musical way of saying, I think I remember that. But I find myself wondering the more I sit with it, whether it is quite as arbitrary as it seems, because in a world organized by bells, the sound of a bell was precisely the mechanism by which memory was activated. When the market bell rang, you remembered I need to go to the market. When the passing bell rang, you remembered someone in this community as dying. When the canonical hour's bell rang, you remembered it is time to pray. The bell was the trigger for collective memory. The thing that made you recall what you were supposed to do, where you were supposed to be, what the moment required of you. That rings a bell. A memory activated by sound. In a world where bells were the primary memory activation system of daily life, where the whole community's schedule was stored not in individual calendars, but in a shared acoustic pattern, that phrase is less metaphor and more description. Let me take you now to a place you might not expect to find the legacy of medieval bells, the stock exchange, specifically the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. Every trading day at 9:30 in the morning, a bell rings on the floor of the exchange to signal the official opening of trading. Every trading day at 4 in the afternoon, a bell rings again to signal the close. No trading is permitted before the opening bell. No new orders can be executed after the closing bell. The bell marks the boundary between the legitimate market and the illegitimate one, between the time when commerce is authorized and the time when it is not. Sound familiar? It is in its essential structure the same system as the medieval market bell, the same logic, the same function, the same authority delegated to sound. The technology that produces the sound is different. The financial instruments being traded are incomprehensibly more complex. The scale is global rather than local. But the bell itself, its role, its authority, the way its sound divides time into before and after, legal and not legal, open and closed, that is medieval. And interestingly, the tradition of the stock exchange bell did not grow out of any conscious imitation of medieval practice. It grew organically from the simple practical need to have a shared signal that told everyone in a noisy, crowded room, now we begin. The same need that drove every medieval market town to hang a bell in a tower and ring it at the same time every morning. Human beings converge on the same solutions independently across centuries, because some needs are fundamental enough that the solutions are almost inevitable. Now let me tell you about something that is still happening today. Right now, in a town in southern England, the town of Sandwich in Kent, one of the original Cinque Ports, the 5 medieval harbour towns of the English south coast that were granted special privileges in exchange for providing ships to the crown, rings a curfew bell every evening at 8 o'clock. It has done this for approximately 950 years. 950 years. The bell is hung in the tower of St. Peter's Church in the centre of town. Every evening a team of local volunteers takes turns climbing the tower and ringing the tenor bell, the one called the pig bell, for 10 minutes. Not automatically, not mechanically, not through a timer or a recording or any modern convenience, by hand. By a person who climbed the stairs, took hold of the rope and pulled. The same way it was done in the 11th century. There is no legal requirement to do this. No fire regulation being served, no curfew law being enforced. The people of Sandwich ring the bell every evening because they have always rung the bell every evening. Because the sound is part of who they are, part of what makes the town recognizable to itself, and I find that genuinely moving. Not as a piece of historical curiosity, but as an act of collective choice. A community deciding together that some things are worth preserving not because they are useful, but because they are true. True to a place, true to a memory, true to the long chain of people who heard the same sound before them and will hear it if that community keeps its promise long after. Here is a question I want you to sit with. What do you think those 950 years of evening bell ringing actually represent? Is it tradition for tradition's sake, a quaint habit that a small English town has not gotten around to abandoning? Or is it something more intentional than that? I think it is a choice. A conscious, repeated daily choice to remain connected to a past that most of the world has forgotten, to say this sound was important to the people who came before us, and we choose to honour that. Not because we need the bell to tell us to cover our fires, but because the bell tells us something else. It tells us we are not the first people to have lived in this place. It tells us that the people who rang this bell before us were real, and their lives mattered, and they too had evenings that came to an end and mornings that began again. The bell connects the living to the dead in the most literal possible way, through sound, through the same sound, across nearly 1,000 years. There is one more piece of this linguistic and cultural legacy that I want to share before we move on. It involves one of the most famous sentences in English poetry. We've already heard it in this story, in the context of the death knell, but I want to return to it now from a slightly different angle. John Donne wrote in 1624, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." And then, "Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." That passage has become so famous, so often quoted, so thoroughly absorbed into the general cultural atmosphere that it is easy to forget that it was not written as philosophy. It was written as description. Donne was writing about a specific practice, the death knell, the counting bell. The bell that rang in every English parish for every person who died, telling the town not just that someone had gone, but how long they had lived. He was writing about a world in which the death of any person was made public, made communal, made impossible to ignore, not because anyone required you to feel anything, but because the bell required you to hear, and hearing in a world of medieval bells was never a passive experience. It demanded something of you. A pause, a prayer, an acknowledgement that the life that had just ended had been real and had mattered. For whom the bell tolls. 4 words, still alive, still carrying inside them the sound of a bronze bell in a stone tower ringing in an English town that most of us have never visited for a person whose name we will never know. I have been thinking as this story has unfolded about what it would mean to hear the world the way medieval people heard it. To step outside on a Tuesday morning and have the air around you be full of information, layered, specific, communally shared information. The prime bell has rung. The day has begun. The market will open at terce. The passing bell rang last evening for someone in the north quarter of town, a man perhaps 50 years old. All of that communicated through sound, through the shared vocabulary of a community that had learned over generations to read the air as carefully as any written page. We have gained so much since then. I do not want to pretend otherwise. The access to information we have today, the ability to know what is happening on the other side of the world in real time, to carry the sum of human knowledge in a device that fits in a pocket is genuinely extraordinary. But we have also lost something quieter, something harder to name, the experience of time as a shared thing, of information as a communal possession, of sound as a bond between people who would otherwise have no connection except proximity. The bells that organise medieval life are largely silent now, not all of them. The church bells of Sunday morning still ring in many towns. The Sandwich curfew bell rings every evening. The great cathedrals of England and Europe still ring their changes on feast days. But the bell no longer tells us when to wake, or when the market opens, or when the working day is done, or when a neighbour has died and we should pause together to acknowledge it. Those functions have been distributed across 1,000 different private channels. Your alarm clock, your phone notification, the app that tells you the store is open, the text message that tells you someone is gone, private signals, individual communications, messages sent to you specifically, not broadcast to the whole community. And in that shift from the public bell to the private notification, something about the nature of community itself has changed. We are all in a certain sense more alone now than the baker in Canterbury, who woke every morning to a sound that told him unmistakably that he was part of something larger than himself. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. The need that the bells served has not gone away. The need to feel that time is shared, that the moments of the day, their beginnings and their endings, their celebrations and their sorrows, are witnessed by others, that we're not each of us spinning alone through our individual schedules without any connection to the larger rhythm of human life around us. That need is ancient, and it is still here. And perhaps that is why when we hear a bell, a church bell on a quiet Sunday morning, a school bell marking the end of a lesson, a clock tower striking the hour in an unfamiliar city, something in us still responds, not with conscious thought, not with historical knowledge, but with something older than both, recognition, the feeling that this sound has always been here, that we've always known it, that it is telling us something we have not forgotten so much as simply stopped listening for. We are almost at the end of this story, and I want to use the final part of it to bring everything we have explored together in a way that I hope will stay with you. Because there is one last dimension of the medieval bell's legacy that we have not yet fully reckoned with. One final thing that those bells were doing beyond organizing commerce, beyond marking death, beyond calling prayer, beyond enforcing law and enforcing silence, and reaching into the superstitions and the magical thinking of ordinary people. One final thing that I think is the most important of all, and it has to do not with what the bells sounded like, but with what the world sounded like between the bells, with the silence itself, with what it meant and what it still means to live inside a rhythm of sound and quiet presence and absence, noise and peace. That is where this story ends, and it begins right now. There is a particular quality to silence that most of us have stopped noticing. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a muted phone or a paused video, the deeper silence, the silence that only exists in genuine contrast to sound, the silence that comes after a bell has rung and its last vibration has faded into the air and there is nothing left but the echo of what just was. That silence. Medieval people knew that silence in a way we simply do not, and understanding what it meant to them not as an absence but as a presence of its own is, I think, the key to understanding something about ourselves that we have been quietly losing without realizing it. Let me take you to a specific moment. It is a Thursday morning in the city of York. The year is 1320, give or take a decade. The prime bell has just rung, not 5 seconds ago. The last stroke is still in the air, still vibrating in the stone of the tower, still moving through the streets, still reaching the ears of the last people in the outermost lanes of the city. And then it is gone. What follows is not nothing. What follows is a particular kind of quiet that the people of York have known since childhood. A quiet that has a texture to it. A quality of suspension, the feeling of the whole city having taken a breath and not yet released it. The sexton has climbed back down the tower stairs. The baker is sliding the first loaves into the oven. The merchant is loading his cart. And for a few minutes, perhaps 15, perhaps 20, before the sounds of the working day build back to their usual density, the city exists in that particular in-between state. After the bell, before the noise. The medieval world called this nothing specific. It had no name for it. It simply was. But I think it was one of the most psychologically important experiences in the daily life of a medieval town. Here is what I mean. The bell-organized day was at its core a day built around rhythm, sound then silence, signal then response, announcement then action. This alternating structure, this breathing in and breathing out of the acoustic world, created something that modern psychology would recognize immediately as a regulated nervous system. The bell rang. You knew what it meant. You responded. And then you had the interval before the next bell to simply do your work, exist in your life, be present in whatever task was at hand. You were not waiting for the next notification. You were not half attending to the current moment while part of your mind monitored for incoming signals. You were here, in this task, in this hour. Until the bell told you otherwise. And when the bell rang again, you would know. There was no chance of missing it. No anxiety about whether you might have missed it. It was public. It was loud. It was for everyone. And that certainty, the certainty that the next signal would reach you without any effort on your part, freed you to be genuinely present in the intervals between. I want to contrast that with something. Right now, in this moment, as you are listening to this story, how many things are quietly competing for your attention? Maybe your phone is nearby, its screen dark, but its notifications potentially accumulating. Maybe there is a part of your mind that is running a background check every few minutes. Has anything happened? Has anything come in? Has anything changed? We have a word for this now. Researchers who study attention and the modern information environment call it continuous partial attention, the state of being perpetually available to incoming signals, never fully committed to the present moment, always monitoring even while doing something else for the next thing that might require a response. It is exhausting in a way that is hard to describe because it is so constant that it has become the baseline. We do not notice the exhaustion of it until we go somewhere without signal, a remote campsite, a long flight over the ocean, and suddenly discover that the background hum of monitoring we'd been carrying all along simply stops, and we feel unexpectedly like ourselves again. Medieval people did not have that particular form of exhaustion, not because their lives were easier. Their lives were by almost any material measure significantly harder than ours, but because their information system was designed differently. The bell would come to them. They did not need to go to it. They did not need to monitor for it. They did not need to carry it with them everywhere they went and check it every 7 minutes just in case. It would find them. It always found everyone. And in the meantime, the silence between the bells was genuinely theirs. Now I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this argument that tips into romanticizing the medieval world in ways that are not honest. Medieval life was not peaceful in any simple sense. The bells regulated a world of genuine hardship, disease, hunger, political violence, the ever-present possibility that everything you owned could be destroyed by fire or flood or the passage of an army. The silence between bells was not the silence of contentment. For many people it was the silence of exhaustion, of grief, of worry about next winter's grain stores. I do not want to paint the medieval acoustic world as a kind of therapy session that modern people have foolishly abandoned. But I do think there is something genuinely worth examining in the structural difference between a world with clear, shared communal signals and long intervals of acoustic freedom, and a world of constant private individual signals with almost no intervals at all. Let me tell you about a study that I find relevant here. Researchers studying the effects of urban soundscapes on human well-being have found consistently that what matters most is not the total volume of sound in a person's environment. It is the predictability of it. Loud, predictable sound is significantly less stressful than quiet, unpredictable sound. A factory worker exposed to consistent, regular mechanical noise shows lower stress markers than an office worker who's exposed to intermittent, irregular interruptions, phone calls, message alerts, colleagues stopping by unexpectedly. The irregular interruption, it turns out, is more cognitively costly than the steady noise, because the irregular interruption requires constant monitoring, constant readiness, constant alertness to the possibility that something might be about to demand your attention. The steady noise paradoxically can be habituated, screened out, allowed to pass through the background of awareness without triggering a response. Medieval bells were loud. By modern standards, they were extremely loud for the people living closest to them, but they were also within their system highly predictable. The prime bell came at prime, the market bell came at the market hour, the Compline bell came at Compline, every day, with enough consistency that the body could learn the rhythm and stop monitoring for it. Stop monitoring and simply live. The monks understood something about this that took modern neuroscience centuries to confirm. The structure of the canonical hours was not designed purely as a theological exercise. It was designed, whether consciously or through accumulated wisdom, to create a life in which the self was repeatedly returned to the present moment. The bell rang. You stopped. You prayed. You let go of whatever you'd been doing and were for a few minutes simply here. And then you returned to your work. This pattern, sustained attention, structured interruption return is almost precisely what modern mindfulness practice recommends as the framework for a psychologically healthy relationship with time and attention. The monks did not call it mindfulness, they called it the divine office. But the underlying architecture of the thing, the deliberate punctuation of the day, with moments of full presence followed by the freedom to be absorbed in work until the next punctuation arrived, that is not medieval. That is human. That is what a well-designed day looks like. There is a specific bell in this story that I've been saving for this moment, the Compline bell. We touched on it briefly when we discussed the canonical hours, but I want to return to it now and give it the attention it deserves, because Compline was different from all the other hours. It was the last bell of the day, the bell that closed the monastic schedule, the bell after which, in the rule of St. Benedict, the great silence of the monastery began. Not just reduced talking, not just quieter activity, silence, complete and maintained until the matin's bell before dawn. The Compline prayers themselves were among the most beautiful in the entire liturgy. Short, gentle, oriented toward rest and protection. Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. Keep us safe while we are awake and guard us while we sleep. And the bell that preceded these prayers was understood to mark something more than just the end of the working day. It marked the end of the self's active engagement with the world. The moment after which you could stop solving problems, stop monitoring for threats, stop being productive or useful or responsive. The moment at which it was not just permitted but required to simply rest. I wonder sometimes what it would feel like to have a bell like that. Not a bedtime alarm, not the passive act of putting your phone down and hoping to fall asleep. An actual signal, public, communal, unmistakable. A bell that said the day is done. Not for you specifically, for everyone. The whole community is releasing the day at this moment. You do not need to check anything. You do not need to respond to anything. Whatever is unfinished will still be there when the morning bell rings. Right now, in this moment that we're all sharing together, the world has officially given you permission to stop. There is a reason that bell made people weep when it returned after the interdict. There is a reason the monks who lived their lives inside its rhythm described the Compline bell with a reverence that went beyond theology. The Compline bell was permission, and permission to rest, genuine communal, externally granted permission to stop and be still, is something that many people today are quietly starving for. Let me tell you about something that happened in the town of Bury St. Edmunds in England sometime in the late 12th century. Bury St. Edmunds was a prosperous market town dominated by a large and influential Benedictine abbey. The abbot of that abbey controlled, among other things, the ringing of the bells that organised the town's daily life, and at some point in the late 1100s the townspeople of Bury St. Edmunds decided they wanted their own bell. Not the abbey bell, not the bell controlled by the abbot rung on the abbey's schedule for the abbey's purposes, their own bell, a civic bell, a bell that answered to the town rather than to the church. The conflict that resulted documented in the chronicles of a monk named Jocelyn of Brakelond, who was present at the abbey during this period, was fierce. The abbot resisted. The townspeople pressed. The dispute went on for years. And what strikes me most about reading Jocelyn's account of it is the passion that the townspeople brought to the fight. They were not arguing about money. They were not arguing about specific regulations or trading hours or market access. They were arguing about who had the right to organize their time, whose bell would tell them when the day had begun, whose voice would mark the rhythm of their lives. This was a question about sovereignty, about self-determination, about the most fundamental question a community can ask itself: who speaks for us here? The Civic bell tower, the belfry that stood in the market square rather than in the churchyard that answered to the mayor rather than the bishop, became over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries one of the defining symbols of urban self-governance in medieval Europe. In the cities of Flanders and northern Italy, particularly regions where urban commerce was most advanced, and where the tensions between civic and ecclesiastical authority were most sharply drawn, the construction of a civic bell tower was an act of political declaration. We are a city, we govern ourselves, and we ring our own bells. The famous belfry of Bruges in Belgium, still standing today, a medieval tower that has dominated the city's skyline for 700 years, was built in the 13th century specifically as a civic symbol. Not a church, not a cathedral, a municipal building, housing municipal bells that rang on municipal schedules for municipal purposes. The opening of the cloth market, the closing of the trading day, the assembling of the city council, all organised by bells that answered to the city, not to God's representatives on earth. There is something I find deeply moving about that story, because it suggests that the relationship between medieval communities and their bells was not simply one of passive reception. Communities did not just accept whatever acoustic world the church provided. They wanted more, they negotiated, they fought. They built their own towers and hung their own bells and claimed through that act a form of self-determination that expressed itself not in political manifestos or legal arguments, but in sound. We ring our own bells here. That is a statement of identity, of community, of the right to organize your own time and announce your own rhythms to the world. And I think there is something in that impulse, the desire to have your own bell, to speak for yourself rather than be spoken for, that connects directly to questions we are still asking today. About who controls the platforms through which we communicate, about who sets the algorithms that determine what we see and when, about who decides in the modern information environment which signals reach us and which do not. The townspeople of Bury St Edmunds wanted their own bell because they understood something essential. Whoever controls the bell controls attention. Whoever controls attention controls the shape of daily life. That understanding was medieval. The stakes it describes are entirely current. There is one more thing I want to tell you in this part of the story. It is small, quiet, almost the opposite of everything dramatic we've been discussing. But I think it might be the most important thing of all. In many medieval towns there was a bell that rang not for commerce, not for law, not for death, not for alarm. It rang at night, in the deep middle of the night, when the town was as still as it ever got. This bell was not mentioned in any official schedule. It was not required by any canon law or civic ordinance. It was rung by the night watchman, not to signal danger, not to wake anyone up, simply to mark the hours. 1 stroke for 1 o'clock, 2 strokes for 2 o'clock, 3 for 3. A gentle soft tolling in the darkness, not loud enough to wake the sleeping, loud enough to be heard by anyone who was already awake, anyone lying in the dark with their worries, anyone unable to sleep, anyone sitting with a sick child or a grieving heart, or simply the particular restlessness that visits everyone occasionally in the long hours between midnight and dawn. That bell said, I am here. The night is being watched. You're not alone in it. Someone else is awake, moving through the darkness, counting the hours until morning. It was not a signal that required a response. It was not information that demanded action. It was simply presence. The presence of the community in its darkest and most vulnerable hours. The sound of a human being acknowledging that the night is long and the darkness is real, and you are not enduring it in isolation. The bell rang, and whoever heard it knew someone is out there. The night is held. The hours are passing. Morning is coming. I think about that bell sometimes when I am awake in the early hours and the house is quiet and the particular quality of 3 in the morning settles over everything. I think about what it would be like to hear through the darkness a single gentle stroke, not demanding anything, not signalling crisis, just marking the hour, just saying I know you are awake. And the night, though long, will end. We have come a long way in this story. From the chaos of a medieval market square without a shared sense of time to the cosmic authority of the baptized bell. From the intricate language of the death knell to the weaponized silence of the interdict. From the magical thinking of women wrapping their girdles around consecrated bronze to the philosophical conflict between bells and clocks. From the words we still use every day without knowing their acoustic origins to the night watchman's gentle toll in the sleeping darkness of a medieval town. And through all of it, one thing has remained constant: the human need for shared rhythm, for a sound that is not yours alone, that belongs to everyone, that speaks to everyone, that holds everyone together inside the same moment. The human need to know that the day has begun, that the market is open, that the danger has passed, that someone you loved has been witnessed on their way out of the world, that the night is being kept. That need has not gone anywhere. It is still here in all of us, right now. And the final part of this story, the part that I have been building toward across everything we have explored, is about exactly that. About what we do with that need in a world where the bells have mostly fallen silent, about what fills the space they left, about what it might mean to listen again for something that binds us together rather than separating us one by one into our private, individual, perfectly curated streams of sound. That is where this story ends, and it begins in just a moment. Every story has a moment where it folds back on itself, where the ending reaches toward the beginning, and you realize with a quiet kind of surprise that you have been circling something all along without quite knowing what it was. This is that moment. We started with Thomas the baker in the dark, waiting for a sound that would tell him the day had begun, and we end here, with you, listening, in whatever quiet corner of the world you've made for yourself tonight. I want to tell you about something that happened in the city of Florence in the early 14th century. Not a battle, not a plague, not a political upheaval. Something smaller, more ordinary, and I think more revealing. A poet named Dante Alighieri, who was living in exile from Florence at the time, having been expelled from the city he loved, in the year 1302 wrote about the bells of his hometown with a specificity and a tenderness that even 700 years later reaches through the page. In his great work he described the bell of the Badia Fiorentina, the abbey bell that had rung over the neighbourhood of his childhood, as the bell that accompanied his young life. He knew its sound the way you know the sound of something you grew up next to. Not consciously, not analytically, in your body, in your memory, in the part of yourself that is formed before you have words for what is forming. And in exile, separated from that sound by hundreds of miles, and the particular cruelty of political banishment, he wrote about it the way people write about what they have lost. With the ache of the specific, not the general loss of home, but the loss of that bell, that particular tone, that particular rhythm against the Florentine morning. I've been thinking about that passage about Dante and his bell for much of the time I've spent putting this story together, because it says something about the relationship between sound and identity that goes beyond anything historical or analytical. It says that the sounds we grow up inside become part of who we are, not as metaphor, as neuroscience. Researchers who study auditory memory have found that sounds experienced in early childhood are encoded differently from sounds encountered later in life. They go deeper. They become associated with emotion, with safety, with the fundamental feeling of being in a familiar world. And when those sounds are taken away through exile, through the passage of time, through the simple fact of the world changing around us, the loss is felt not just emotionally but physically, as a kind of homesickness that has no precise home to point toward. Dante missed his bell, not just Florence, not just his house, his neighbours, his language, his bell, the specific acoustic signature of the place that had made him. Now here is the question I've been circling toward through this entire story. If sounds that we grow up inside become part of who we are, if the acoustic environment of childhood and community shapes identity in ways that go deeper than conscious thought, what are we becoming? What identity are we forming in a world where the shared communal sounds have largely been replaced by private, individual, algorithmically curated streams of audio, where the bell that spoke to everyone has been replaced by the notification that speaks only to you, where the rhythm that bound a whole community to the same moment has been replaced by the infinite variety of rhythms that each individual curates for themselves? I am not asking this rhetorically. I genuinely do not know the answer. But I think it is one of the most important questions of our time, and I think the story of medieval bells of all places is one of the most clarifying lenses through which to look at it. Because here is what medieval bells actually gave people. Not just time, not just information, not just signal and alarm and the marking of important moments. They gave people a shared sonic identity. The people of York sounded different from the people of Canterbury because their bells were different. Different sizes, different tones, different local ringing patterns that had developed over generations. You could travel from one English town to another in the 14th century and know from the sound of the bells alone that you were somewhere different. The bells of each town were as distinct as its dialect, as personal as its history, as recognizable as the face of someone you grew up with. And the people who lived inside those bells, who heard them every day for their entire lives, who organized their existence around them, who associated them with every significant moment they had ever experienced. Those people had a relationship to place that most of us today can barely imagine. Not just knowing where they lived, but hearing it every morning, every evening, through joy and grief and ordinary Tuesdays. The sound of home was not a metaphor. It was a bell. Here is something that surprises almost everyone who hears it. The tradition of English change ringing the extraordinarily complex mathematical practice of ringing bells in precisely calculated sequences, where a team of ringers works through hundreds or thousands of permutations without repeating a pattern, is still alive today. Not as a museum piece, not as a weekend historical recreation, as a living practice community-based art form with thousands of active participants across England and around the world. There are approximately 40,000 church bell towers in England. Approximately 6,000 of them have rings of bells suitable for change ringing, and in those towers every week teams of people climb the stairs, take hold of the ropes, and spend an hour or two ringing changes together, listening to each other, adjusting to each other, creating in the air above their town a sound that has been continuous in various forms since before any of their grandparents were born. They do not get paid. They receive no social media recognition. They are not famous. They are accountants and teachers and retired bus drivers and university students, and people who found their way to a bell tower one afternoon and discovered something they had not known they were looking for. A community organized around a shared rhythm, a skill that requires genuine listening not to yourself but to the people around you, a practice that produces something only possible when multiple individuals subordinate their individual timing to a collective pattern. Something, in other words, that the medieval bell made possible and that the modern world has made increasingly rare. I want to tell you about one more person before this story ends. His name was Fabian Stedman. He lived in England in the 17th century, the 1600s, and he was by trade a printer. But what he is remembered for by the small community of people who remember him at all is something he did on Sunday mornings and occasional weekday evenings. He rang bells, and he thought about ringing bells with such sustained mathematical, almost obsessive attention that he eventually wrote 2 books about the theory of change ringing works that systematized the art into something that could be taught, replicated, and built upon. His system, or the refinements of his system, is still in use today. When a team of ringers in a tower in rural Somerset or downtown Cambridge works through a method called grandsire doubles or plain bob minor, they are following patterns that trace back to ideas that Stedman and his contemporaries worked out in the 1600s. A printer, thinking about bells, writing down his thoughts, and 350 years later people are still using what he wrote in towers on Sunday mornings, making the air above their towns speak in a language that is older than any of them. I think about Fabian Stedman sometimes when I consider the question of what lasts. We live in an era of extraordinary productivity. More words are written every day than in any previous century. More images made, more sounds recorded, more ideas expressed, and yet most of it evaporates almost immediately. The tweet of this morning is forgotten by this evening. The viral moment of this week is replaced by a different viral moment next week. What lasts? Stedman's bell-ringing theory has lasted 350 years and is still in active use. The Compline bell at the Abbey of St. Benedict in southern France, which has rung every evening without significant interruption since the 6th century, is still ringing. The curfew bell at Sandwich in Kent, which has rung every evening for nearly 1,000 years, is still ringing. These things last, not because they are written down in books, though some of them are, but because communities choose actively and repeatedly to keep them alive. Because people show up in towers, in abbeys, in small English market towns, and pull the rope. There is a moment in the practice of change ringing that experienced ringers describe as the most extraordinary experience the art can offer. It happens not during the ringing itself, but in the seconds immediately before it begins. The team stands in the tower, each person holding their rope, waiting. The leader gives the signal, and in the instant before the first bell swings there is silence. A particular kind of silence. The silence of multiple people breathing together, attending to the same moment, their attention gathered and focused and ready. The silence of a community about to speak with one voice. And then the first bell moves, and the sound that fills the tower, the sound that spills out through the louvered openings and rolls across the rooftops and reaches, if the morning is still, for miles in every direction, is not the sound of any one bell. It is the sound of all of them together, each one individual, each one distinct, each one the product of a specific person's hands and timing and years of practice, and yet together creating something that no single bell could produce alone, something that requires the community, something that is only possible when each person is listening genuinely, carefully, humbly, listening to everyone around them. I think that is the thing this whole story has been moving toward. Not a historical argument, not a thesis about time or commerce or ecclesiastical power, but this, the image of a group of people standing in a tower in the silence before the ringing, listening to each other breathe, ready to create together something they cannot create alone, ready to be part of a sound that is larger than any of them. That is what the bells of medieval towns were always doing. Not just marking time, not just organising commerce and death and prayer and alarm, creating the experience of being part of something larger than yourself, giving every person within earshot a moment every day, multiple times a day, in which they were not isolated individuals navigating private schedules, but members of a community, of a shared world, of a sound that held them all. And here is what I want to leave you with. That experience, the experience of being held inside a sound that belongs to everyone, is not gone from the world. It is rarer than it used to be, harder to find, easier to miss, but it is still there. In the church bells that ring on Sunday mornings in towns that have not forgotten them. In the school bell that still releases children into the afternoon. In the stadium crowd that roars together at the exact same moment 1,000 people, strangers to each other, briefly inside the same sound. In the concert hall where an orchestra holds the final note and the audience holds its breath, united in the last instant before the silence. In the sound of rain on a roof heard by everyone in a house, gathering them into a shared sensory experience without anyone choosing it. In this moment, actually, right now, you and I sharing this story across whatever distance separates us, whatever city, whatever country, whatever hour it is where you are inside the same voice, the same rhythm, the same unfolding of meaning through time. That is a kind of bell too. Not bronze, not hanging in a stone tower, but doing something of the same work, reaching across space, marking time together, saying in this moment you are not alone. The bells of the medieval world have been largely silent for centuries now. The system they maintained, that extraordinary acoustic architecture of shared time and communal rhythm, has dissolved into the private individual endlessly fragmented information landscape we inhabit today. And there is no going back. Nor should there be. The world the bells organised was also a world of plague and poverty, and brutal inequality, and lives cut short by things we have since learned to prevent. We do not romanticize it, but we can learn from it. We can notice what it understood about the relationship between sound and community, between shared rhythm and shared identity, between listening to the same thing at the same time and feeling in that simple act less alone. We can ask ourselves what the bells of our own lives are, what sounds we share with the people around us, what rhythms hold us together rather than sorting us into separate streams, and we can choose with whatever agency we have to make those sounds and those rhythms real, to show up for them, to pull the rope, even when no one requires us to, especially then. There is a phrase that English bell ringers use when a peal is particularly well rung. They say it was true, not accurate, not technically correct, not well executed, true. A ringing is true when every bell is in its right place, every stroke falling exactly where it should, every ringer listening perfectly to every other, the whole thing unfolding with a kind of inevitability that feels less like performance and more like discovery, like the pattern was always there waiting to be found, and the ringers simply found it together. True ringing. I've been thinking about that word throughout this entire story, because I think it captures something about what the bells were at their best for the communities that heard them. Not just functional, not just loud, true. A sound that told the truth about the community, about its rhythms and its needs and its sorrows and its celebrations, about the fact that human beings left to themselves will reach for each other, will create systems of shared signal and shared response, will build towers and hang heavy things in them and ring those things to say we are here together in this moment in this place. We are here. Thank you, genuinely thank you, for spending these hours with me inside this story, for following the bells from Thomas the Baker's dark kitchen all the way to a printer named Stedman in the 17th century and a tower in Kent where someone is pulling a rope tonight at 8 o'clock, just as someone did 900 years ago. For being willing to listen, and listening, as this story has tried to show, is never a passive act. It is a form of presence, a form of attention, a form of care, and you brought all of that here tonight. I hope something in this story stays with you. Maybe the next time you hear a church bell you will hear it differently, not just as a pleasant sound in the background of a Sunday morning, but as the distant voice of something very old. Something that has been trying for centuries and centuries to tell us what we keep forgetting and keep needing to remember. That time is better when it is shared. That sound can hold a community together. That the silence between the bells, the intervals we're given to simply be present in our lives is not empty. It is full of everything the bell was preparing us to receive. If this story found you at the right moment, if it gave you something to think about or something to feel, or simply a few hours of good company at the end of a long day, please share it with someone you think might need it. Leave a comment below and tell me, is there a bell in your life? A sound that marks your days, that holds your mornings, that tells you the day is done. I would genuinely love to know. And if you've been listening to these stories for a while and have not yet subscribed, now would be a wonderful time. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about the hidden rhythms of the past, about the ordinary things that turned out to be extraordinary, about the people who lived before us and left in the texture of the world we inhabit more traces of themselves than we usually know to look for. The next story is already waiting, and I will be right here when you're ready for it. Sleep well tonight, and listen if you can for the silence between the sounds. That is where everything worth keeping lives.